The first breath a child takes in the Imperium of Man is often their most dangerous. On hive worlds like Necromunda or Armageddon, where billions are crammed into towering arcologies that scrape through polluted atmospheres, infant mortality hovers somewhere between 30 and 60% in the lower levels. The exact figures remain unknown because nobody bothers counting. In the Underhive, where toxic runoff pools in ancient foundations and recycled air carries spores of exotic fungal blooms, babies die from respiratory failure, chemical poisoning, or simple starvation before they see their first month. Midwives, if they exist at all, are usually other women from the same hab block who have seen enough births to know which end comes first. Medical equipment consists of whatever can be scavenged from upper levels or stolen from Medicae caravans. The situation improves marginally in the manufactorum districts of the Mid-Hive, where workers receive basic medical screening as part of their labor contracts. Here, pregnant women might actually see a Medicae servitor or junior chirurgeon once during their term, though the examination focuses less on maternal health and more on ensuring the fetus displays no obvious mutations that would waste the Imperium's resources. A cleft palate might be overlooked. An extra finger will not. The Adeptus Arbites maintain genetic purity standards that vary by world, but universally condemn anything that deviates from the accepted human template. On some worlds, this means a third nipple warrants immediate execution. On others, the threshold sits higher, but not by much. Agri-worlds present different challenges. On breadbasket planets like Krieg before its nuclear devastation, or the endless grain fields of Ceres Reach, births occur in communal serf barracks under the supervision of whatever passes for medical authority in rural imperial settlements. The Adeptus Munitorum requires these worlds to maintain population quotas alongside their food tithes, which means births are encouraged, but only within acceptable parameters. Women typically give birth while still working the fields, taking perhaps a day or two of rest before returning to their labor assignments. The children join them as soon as they can walk, learning to identify crop diseases and operate harvesting equipment before they learn to read, if they ever learn to read at all. Forge worlds operate on entirely different principles. On Mars, Risa, or Graea, the Adeptus Mechanicus views human reproduction as an inefficient but necessary process for maintaining worker populations. Pregnant tech thralls receive marginally increased rations and are reassigned from heavy industrial work to lighter duties like sorting components or monitoring machines' spirit appeasement rituals. The Mechanicus conducts extensive genetic screening on all newborns, not merely for mutations, but for desirable traits that might produce future tech priests or Skidarii. Infants showing high cognitive function markers are separated from their parents within weeks and entered into Mechanicus training programs. The rest return to their parents until they're old enough for augmentation and work assignment. The culling of mutants follows established protocols across the Imperium, though implementation varies by local authority. On worlds with strong ecclesiarchy presence, the Fraterus militia or local preacher gangs conduct regular genetic screenings, dragging suspected mutants from their homes for public execution. These killings serve dual purposes, eliminating genetic deviancy and reinforcing the population's terror of straying from the Emperor's light. The Adeptus Arbites handle cullings more bureaucratically on civilized worlds, maintaining genetic purity databases and conducting scheduled screenings at manufactorum gates or hab block checkpoints. Suspected mutants receive trials that last anywhere from 5 minutes to an hour before summary execution. Their bodies are typically rendered down in corpse starch facilities, waste not, want not. Children who survive their first years face immediate indoctrination into imperial ideology. The Ministorum operates catechism classes across virtually every imperial world, mandatory attendance enforced by local authorities. These classes begin as soon as children can speak, teaching the fundamental truths of the Imperial Creed through rote memorization and physical punishment. A typical session involves hours of reciting prayers to the God Emperor, learning the approved litanies for different occasions, and memorizing the proper forms of obeisance to imperial authorities. Instructors, usually minor clerics or lay preachers, carry shock mauls or lash whips to correct doctrinal errors. A child who cannot recite the prayer of devotion by age 5 might receive 10 lashes. A child who questions the emperor's divinity receives far worse. The Schola Progenium represents a different path entirely, reserved for orphans of imperial servants who died in the emperor's service. These institutions, scattered across segmentum capitals and major imperial worlds, take in children whose parents served in the imperial guard, adeptus arbites, or various branches of the administratum. The Schola provides education, military training, and ideological conditioning far beyond what common citizens receive. Students learn to read and write High Gothic, study imperial history and tactics, and undergo rigorous physical conditioning. The Schola's purpose is producing the next generation of commissars, stormtroopers, sororitas, and mid-level administrators. Life inside these institutions is harsh but structured, with every hour scheduled and every deviation punished. Students who fail to meet standards are reassigned to lesser positions or simply disappear from the records. Work designation begins early in imperial society, often before a child reaches adolescence. On hive worlds, familial obligations typically determine a person's entire life trajectory. A child born to a Prometheum refinery worker will work in Prometheum refineries. A child born to a corpse starch processor will process corpses into starch. The administratum maintains detailed records of labor castes stretching back centuries, and deviation from hereditary work assignments requires extensive paperwork that most citizens cannot navigate. Genetic aptitude testing occurs sporadically, usually when the Adeptus Munitorum needs to fill quotas for specialized positions. A child showing mechanical aptitude might be reassigned to a manufactorum. One displaying unusual physical strength could be flagged for Imperial Guard recruitment. These reassignments are not opportunities, but different forms of servitude. Forge worlds conduct more systematic aptitude testing, with the Mechanicus evaluating children for technical comprehension, mechanical intuition, and compatibility with augmetic enhancement. Those scoring highest enter the lowest ranks of the tech priest hierarchy, beginning decades of training and modification. Most children, however, are designated as menials or tech thralls, their futures involving repetitive industrial labor interspersed with gradual augmentation as their organic components fail or are deemed inefficient. The Mechanicus does not ask permission for these modifications. A child assigned to plasma coil manufacturing will receive optical enhancements whether they consent or not. Childhood on Necromunda's Underhive illustrates the brutal reality of life at the Imperium's lowest levels. Children as young as 5 or 6 join Risic gangs, groups of juveniles who scour the ancient ruins and waste heaps for anything salvageable. They crawl through toxic sludge pools, navigate collapsed hab blocks where one wrong step means falling hundreds of meters, and fight rival gangs over territory containing marginally less contamination. These children learn to identify valuable scrap metal by taste, distinguish between merely poisonous and immediately lethal chemicals, and kill without hesitation. Most die before reaching adulthood from violence, disease, or environmental hazards. Those who survive either join one of the Underhive's gang houses, or if exceptionally lucky and ruthless, make it to the Mid-Hive as hired muscle or factory workers. Agri-world children face different challenges but no less hardship. On worlds like Krieg after its reconstruction or the agricultural colonies of the Segmentum Pacificus, children work the fields alongside adults from age 6 or 7. They learn to operate harvesting machinery designed for adult hands, often suffering injuries from equipment they cannot properly control. During planting and harvest seasons, children work 16 to 18-hour days, sleeping in the fields and eating whatever rations the overseers distribute. Education, if it exists, consists of learning which crops to plant, how to identify soil diseases, and the prayers necessary to ensure the emperor's blessing on the harvest. Literacy is rare and usually limited to those selected for overseer training. The tithe system shapes childhood across all imperial worlds, though its effects manifest differently depending on local conditions. Worlds designated for Imperial Guard recruitment conduct regular physical assessments of children, identifying those suitable for military service years before actual conscription. These children receive marginally better rations and basic combat training, not from any concern for their welfare, but to ensure they meet minimum standards when tithe collectors arrive. Worlds with specialized production requirements screen for relevant aptitudes. A world manufacturing servitors needs children with specific genetic markers for lobotomization. A world producing vat-grown soldiers needs genetic material from the healthiest specimens. Children on civilized worlds experience marginally better conditions, though still grim by any reasonable standard. They attend ministorum schools that teach basic literacy alongside religious indoctrination, learn trades through apprenticeship programs, and live in hab blocks with functional sanitation. Yet even here, the Imperium's weight crushes individual potential beneath collective necessity. A child showing artistic talent will not become an artist unless their family can afford the bribes necessary to enter an artisan guild. A child displaying scientific curiosity will not become a scholar unless they catch the attention of amigos looking for research assistance. Most children simply follow their parents' paths, generation after generation performing the same labor, until death or injury renders them unable to work. The Imperium does not value children as individuals with potential. It values them as future resources, as biological material to be processed into whatever form serves the Emperor's endless wars and the Administratum's insatiable bureaucratic machinery. From the moment of birth, every child exists to serve, their lives measured not by happiness or fulfillment, but by how efficiently they can be converted into labor, soldiers, or corpse starch when they finally break. The transition from childhood to adult labor occurs without ceremony or recognition. One day a child accompanies their parents to the manufactorum gates, and the next they receive their own work designation chit and ration card. On Armageddon's industrial hives, this typically happens around age 12 or 13, when a child's hands are large enough to operate basic machinery, but their bodies remain small enough to crawl into tight spaces for maintenance work. The administratum clerks who process these work assignments spend perhaps 30 seconds reviewing each case, stamping forms with the same labor designations their parents held, their grandparents before them, and so on through generations of unbroken servitude. Manufactorum complexes dominate the industrial landscape of most imperial worlds, vast structures that can span hundreds of square kilometers and employ millions of workers. On Vestroia, where the entire planet functions as one massive weapons foundry, manufactorums stretch from horizon to horizon, their smokestacks pumping chemical waste into an atmosphere that has not seen natural sunlight in millennia. Inside these facilities, workers operate in conditions that would violate every conceivable safety standard if such standards existed or mattered. The typical shift lasts 16 to 20 hours, determined not by any concern for human endurance, but by production quotas handed down from the Adeptus Munitorum. Workers sleep in shifts at their stations or in cramped rest cells within the manufactorum itself, breathing recycled air thick with metal particulates and chemical vapors. The production floor of a standard munitions manufactorum illustrates these conditions with brutal clarity. Workers stand at assembly lines that move at speeds calibrated for maximum output rather than human capability, their hands performing the same motions thousands of times per shift. A worker might spend their entire life attaching firing mechanisms to las guns, the same movement repeated until their joints deteriorate and their fingers lock into permanent claws. The machinery offers no safety guards, no emergency shutoffs accessible to workers, no accommodations for fatigue or injury. A worker who loses fingers to a stamping press wraps the stumps and continues working. A worker who collapses from exhaustion is dragged aside while the line continues. The overseers, themselves promoted from the worker ranks but now armed with shock mauls and the authority to execute shirkers, maintain production pace through constant threats and sporadic violence. Chemical exposure represents one of the most common hazards in imperial industrial facilities. Promethium refineries on worlds like Talern or Catachan process the Imperium's primary fuel source in vast distillation towers, where temperatures reach levels that melt unprotected flesh. Workers in these facilities wear basic protective gear, usually nothing more than rubberized aprons and cloth masks that do little against the toxic fumes. Promethium vapor causes respiratory damage that leaves workers coughing blood within years of starting their assignments. Skin contact results in chemical burns that never fully heal, leaving workers covered in scar tissue and weeping lesions. The refineries provide no medical treatment beyond basic antiseptic and bandages. Workers who become too damaged to function are processed for corpse starch and replaced. Toxic chemical exposure extends far beyond promethium refineries. Paint shops in manufactorums producing Imperial Guard vehicles use lead-based compounds that cause neurological damage, leaving workers with tremors, memory loss, and eventually complete cognitive collapse. Ammunition factories employ workers who handle phosphex compounds and other chemical weapons without proper protection, their bodies absorbing toxins that cause cancers and organ failure. The administratum tracks these casualties only as production metrics, calculating acceptable loss rates against output requirements. A manufactorum that loses 30% of its workforce annually to chemical exposure operates within normal parameters as long as production quotas are met. The hierarchical structure of imperial labor creates distinct castes with vastly different experiences, though none could be called pleasant. At the absolute bottom exist servitors, lobotomized humans converted into biological robots through extensive surgery and programming. These creatures represent the Imperium's solution to labor requiring neither thought nor complaint. A servitor might spend decades welding the same joint on vehicle chassis, its organic brain reduced to just enough function to perform repetitive tasks, while its augmetic components handle precision and endurance. Servitors feel no pain, express no dissatisfaction, and never organize for better conditions. They simply work until their organic components decay beyond function, at which point they are recycled and new servitors created from the endless supply of criminals, debtors, and those who displeased the wrong authorities. Above servitors, but barely, menial workers form the largest labor class in the Imperium. These individuals retain their full cognitive function, which in practical terms means they can suffer properly. Menials work the assembly lines, haul materials, clean the waste from industrial processes, and perform the countless tasks too variable for servitor programming, but too simple to waste skilled workers on. They receive payment in scrip, company currency valid only at manufactorum-owned shops, where prices ensure workers remain perpetually indebted to their employers. A menial might work 30 years and never accumulate enough actual imperial currency to purchase anything beyond their basic rations. The scrip system functions as debt bondage with extra steps, binding workers to their manufactorums as surely as chains. Ration cards determine access to food, water, and other necessities in most imperial industrial centers. These cards are calibrated to provide exactly enough nutrition to keep workers functional, with no excess for comfort or variety. A standard ration consists of corpse starch formed into dense blocks, protein paste derived from processed algae or recycled biological waste, and water that has been recycled through purification systems so many times it tastes of chemicals and metal. Workers receive these rations at designated distribution centers, queuing for hours after their shifts to collect the gray blocks and paste tubes that constitute their entire diet. The quality varies by world and facility, but nowhere does it rise above barely edible. On some hive worlds, the corpse starch contains enough preservatives and synthetic nutrients that it technically meets caloric requirements while tasting like seasoned cardboard soaked in industrial solvent. HAB block assignments function as another form of compensation and control. Workers who meet their quotas consistently receive housing assignments in mid-level HAB blocks where conditions are merely terrible rather than lethal. These quarters typically consist of a single room measuring perhaps 3 meters by 4 meters, shared by an entire family. Sanitation is communal, with hundreds of workers sharing toilet and washing facilities that function sporadically at best. The walls are thin enough that every conversation, argument, and intimate moment becomes public knowledge. Privacy does not exist. Personal space does not exist. Workers sleep in shifts corresponding to their work schedules, with families rarely gathering all together because someone is always at the manufactorum. Economic advancement remains theoretically possible, but practically impossible for the vast majority of workers. The administratum maintains elaborate records of work performance, with workers accumulating service points over decades of labor. These points can theoretically be redeemed for better housing assignments, additional rations, or transfers to less hazardous work details. In practice, the system functions as another mechanism of control. Overseers distribute points arbitrarily, rewarding favorites and punishing those who show insufficient enthusiasm. Workers who accumulate significant points often find them revoked for minor infractions, or simply lost in administrative errors that take years to correct, if they can be corrected at all. The handful of workers who do manage to advance typically do so by informing on their fellow workers, reporting seditious talk or insufficient devotion to the God Emperor. Guild craftsmen occupy a privileged position within the labor hierarchy, protected by ancient trade monopolies that even the administratum hesitates to challenge. On worlds like Necromunda, the guilds control specific industries through combinations of political influence, economic power, and outright violence. The Prometheum Guild controls all fuel refining and distribution. The Corpse Guild handles body disposal and corpse starch processing. The Water Guild maintains the recycling systems that keep billions alive. These organizations operate as states within states, maintaining their own security forces, legal systems, and succession protocols. Guild craftsmen receive better pay, superior housing, and actual medical care. They learn their trades through apprenticeships that can last decades, mastering skills that are jealously guarded and never written down. Skilled artisans represent the apex of imperial labor, outside the nobility and administratum, individuals whose abilities are rare enough to command genuine respect and compensation. A master weaponsmith who can craft power swords, or a techwright who understands ancient machinery, becomes valuable enough that even planetary governors treat them with consideration. These individuals often work in small workshops rather than massive manufactorums, taking on commissions from wealthy patrons or maintaining equipment too complex for standard workers. They receive payment in actual imperial currency, live in private housing, and sometimes even accumulate enough wealth to pass their positions to their children. Yet even these privileged workers remain trapped within the system, their skills binding them as surely as debt binds menials. Corpse starch processing facilities employ millions across the Imperium, converting the endless dead into nutrition for the endless living. These facilities receive bodies from multiple sources: workers who died at their stations, criminals executed by the Adeptus Arbites, casualties from gang violence, and anyone else whose corpse can be collected and processed. The work involves sorting bodies by condition, removing augmetics and other non-organic materials, and feeding the remains into massive rendering vats where chemicals and heat break down biological tissue into paste. This paste is then processed with synthetic nutrients and preservatives before being formed into the blocks that constitute basic rations. Workers in these facilities develop a particular psychological profile, a detachment from the reality of their labor that borders on dissociation. They handle hundreds of bodies per shift, many of which belong to people they knew, and they do so with the same mechanical efficiency they would bring to any other industrial process. Prometheum refiners work in facilities where the margin between productivity and catastrophic explosion remains razor thin. The refining process involves heating crude promethium to extreme temperatures, separating it into various grades through distillation, and storing the results in tanks that could level entire city blocks if breached. Workers monitor pressure gauges, adjust flow valves, and perform maintenance on equipment that operates at temperatures hot enough to ignite human flesh on contact. Accidents occur with grim regularity. A valve failure might spray superheated promethium across a work crew, killing them instantly. A tank rupture could trigger a chain reaction that destroys the entire facility. The overseers maintain production schedules that prioritize output over safety, pushing equipment beyond recommended operational parameters because the Adeptus Munitorum demands more fuel for the Imperium's endless wars. Munitorium workers handle the vast logistics apparatus that keeps the Imperial Guard supplied across 1 million worlds. These individuals work in warehouse complexes that can span continents, sorting and distributing everything from las guns to ration packs to tank treads. The work is physically demanding, involving constant lifting, carrying, and organizing of materials. The munitorium operates on strict inventory control systems that require workers to account for every item, with discrepancies resulting in immediate investigation and usually execution for suspected theft. Workers develop elaborate systems for tracking materials, often using memory techniques because writing implements are considered potential security risks. A worker might memorize the locations of 10,000 different items, their quantities, and their designated recipients, all while maintaining the physical pace necessary to meet distribution deadlines. The administratum itself employs countless billions in maintaining the bureaucratic machinery that governs the Imperium. These workers sit in vast clerical halls, processing forms, updating records, and filing reports in systems so complex that no single person understands them entirely. A clerk might spend their entire career processing a single type of form, stamping and filing documents whose purpose they neither know nor question. The work destroys minds through sheer monotony, with clerks developing elaborate coping mechanisms to survive decades of identical tasks. Some create personal rituals around their work. Others retreat into fantasy lives that exist only in their minds. Many simply break, continuing to perform their duties with the mechanical precision of servitors, while their inner selves collapse into catatonia. The average imperial citizen will never taste real food in their entire life. What passes for sustenance in the 41st millennium bears only the most technical relationship to nutrition, engineered not for palatability or health, but for maximum caloric efficiency per unit of input material. The primary foodstuff across most imperial worlds is corpse starch, a dense processed block manufactured from recycled organic matter that includes human remains, failed crops, animal waste, and anything else that can be broken down into base proteins and carbohydrates. The manufacturing process involves rendering facilities where bodies and biological waste are fed into massive vats containing enzymes and chemical catalysts that dissolve tissue into a gray-brown slurry. This slurry undergoes further processing to remove toxins, add synthetic vitamins, and achieve the minimum nutritional requirements established by the Adeptus Munitorum for keeping workers functional. Corpse starch facilities operate on every major imperial world, their presence marked by the distinctive smell of rendering flesh and industrial chemicals that permeate surrounding districts. On Necromunda, the Corpse Guild maintains hundreds of processing plants throughout the hive cities, collecting bodies from gang violence, industrial accidents, natural deaths, and executions. The guild pays bounties for bodies in reasonable condition, creating an entire economy around corpse collection. Enterprising individuals operate as body haulers, dragging the dead from underhive ruins or collecting them from manufactorum floors. The guild asks no questions about how the bodies died, maintaining only basic standards about decomposition levels and obvious disease markers. A body that has been dead less than 3 days commands standard rates. Anything more decomposed receives reduced payment but still gets processed. The taste of corpse starch varies by production facility and available input materials, but universally falls somewhere between cardboard and rancid meat. The texture is dense and crumbly, requiring significant chewing to break down, and it leaves a chemical aftertaste that lingers for hours. Workers become accustomed to it through sheer necessity, their palates adjusting to accept the blocks as normal food. Children raised on corpse starch know nothing else and develop no expectations of better. The blocks come in standard sizes calibrated to provide specific caloric amounts, with workers receiving allocations based on their labor classification. A heavy manufactorum worker might receive 3 large blocks per day, totaling perhaps 2,400 calories. A clerk receives 2 smaller blocks providing 1,600 calories. The calculations account for energy expenditure with minimal margin for error. Nutri-paste represents a marginally more palatable alternative, though only marginally. This substance consists of processed algae, synthetic proteins, and various additives formed into a thick paste dispensed from tubes or bulk containers. The algae is typically grown in vast cultivation tanks on hive worlds, fed with recycled wastewater and artificial light. The resulting biomass gets harvested, processed to remove toxins, and mixed with protein synthesized from petroleum byproducts or bacterial cultures. The paste has a consistency similar to thick porridge and a flavor that workers describe as vaguely savory with chemical undertones. It provides complete nutrition in theory, containing all necessary vitamins and minerals, though the synthetic nature of many components means the body processes it inefficiently. Workers who subsist primarily on Nutri paste often develop digestive issues and vitamin deficiencies despite the paste's theoretical completeness. Algae blocks constitute another staple food source, particularly on void stations and ships where growing conditions favor simple organisms. These blocks are literally compressed algae mixed with binding agents and pressed into dense rectangles. They taste overwhelmingly of salt and vegetation, with a texture that ranges from chewy to nearly rock hard depending on processing quality. Some facilities flavor the blocks with chemical additives that provide vague approximations of other tastes. A block might be labeled protein flavor or meat substitute despite containing no actual meat. The flavoring consists of chemical compounds that trigger taste receptors in ways that loosely resemble the target flavor. Workers learn to identify different block types by color and smell, developing preferences based on which varieties cause the least digestive distress. Fungus crops grow in the lower levels of many hive worlds, thriving in the darkness and moisture that characterizes underhive conditions. These fungi range from barely edible to actively toxic, with underhive dwellers developing extensive knowledge about which varieties can be safely consumed. The most common edible types grow in thick mats on decaying organic matter, producing fruiting bodies that can be harvested and eaten raw or cooked. The taste is strongly earthy and often bitter, but the fungi provide genuine nutrition and even some variety in texture and flavor. Underhive communities cultivate fungus gardens in abandoned sections, carefully managing moisture and substrate to maximize yields. These gardens represent valuable resources, often defended by gangs who control the territory. Raids between rival gangs frequently target fungus gardens, with successful raiders carrying off entire harvests. Actual protein from livestock represents an almost unimaginable luxury for the vast majority of imperial citizens. Groks, large domesticated bovines used throughout the Imperium, provide meat on agri-worlds and to wealthy populations on civilized worlds. A grok steak costs more than most workers earn in a month, placing it permanently beyond reach. The animals themselves are hardy creatures capable of surviving in harsh conditions, but they require significant resources to raise and process. Most grok's meat goes to the Imperial Guard, the nobility, and high-ranking administratum officials. Workers might encounter actual meat once or twice in their lives during major imperial celebrations, or if they achieve significant advancement. The taste of real meat becomes almost mythological among the lower classes, described in terms that suggest religious experience rather than simple nutrition. Water reclamation systems on imperial worlds operate continuously, processing the same water molecules through biological and chemical filtration for centuries or millennia. On hive worlds like Armageddon, water that falls as rain is immediately captured and entered into the reclamation cycle, never reaching the ground. The system processes sewage, industrial wastewater, and even moisture extracted from the air through massive dehumidifiers. The water passes through bacterial filters that break down organic contaminants, chemical treatments that neutralize toxins, and finally irradiation to kill any remaining microorganisms. The resulting water is technically pure, but carries a distinctive taste of chemicals and minerals that never quite disappears. Workers describe it as having a metallic quality with undertones that vary by which processing plant handled it. Rationing systems control water distribution as strictly as food, with each citizen receiving allocations based on their work classification and family size. A typical worker receives perhaps 5 liters per day for all purposes, including drinking, washing, and cooking. This amount provides enough for survival, but nothing more. Workers learn to use water efficiently, developing techniques for washing with minimal amounts and reusing water multiple times before disposal. Families collect condensation from pipes and walls, adding these small amounts to their daily rations. During periods of shortage, when equipment failures or increased demand strain the system, rations drop further. Workers have died from dehydration. While surrounded by water, they lacked authorization to access. The black market operates in every imperial city, providing goods and services that official channels cannot or will not supply. These networks range from small-scale operators selling contraband food items to vast criminal organizations controlling entire sectors of underhive commerce. Real food represents one of the most valuable commodities on the black market. A fresh vegetable, something grown in actual soil under real sunlight, commands prices that workers save for years to afford. Meat from animals other than groks, perhaps local wildlife or imported delicacies, sells for fortunes. Black marketeers source these items through various means: theft from official shipments, smuggling from off-world sources, or cultivation in hidden locations that avoid administratum oversight. Amasic, the Imperium's common alcoholic beverage, flows through black market channels in quantities that dwarf official distribution. This potent liquor is distilled from various base materials depending on local availability, ranging from grain alcohol on agri-worlds to synthetic compounds on forge worlds. The official version is heavily regulated and taxed, with workers receiving small rations during sanctioned celebrations. Black market Amasic avoids these restrictions, though quality varies wildly. Some batches are indistinguishable from official product. Others contain impurities that cause blindness or death. Workers accept these risks because Amasic provides one of the few escapes from their existence, a few hours of chemical-induced numbness that makes life temporarily bearable. Obscura represents a more dangerous form of escape, a narcotic derived from various sources depending on planetary conditions. On some worlds it comes from plant extracts. On others it is synthesized in illegal laboratorium facilities. The drug produces intense euphoria followed by deep sedation, offering users complete disconnection from their circumstances. Obscuro addiction is rampant in underhive populations, with entire communities built around its production and distribution. The Adeptus Arbites conduct regular raids against Obscura operations, but the drug's profitability ensures new suppliers constantly emerge. Users develop distinctive physical symptoms over time, including yellowed eyes, tremors, and cognitive decline. Many workers turn to Obscura after injuries or trauma make their lives unbearable, choosing slow death through addiction over continued suffering. The risks associated with black market participation are substantial and frequently lethal. The Adeptus Arbites maintains extensive surveillance networks and informant systems designed to identify illegal commerce. Being caught purchasing black market goods results in immediate arrest, with sentences ranging from years of penal servitude to summary execution, depending on the nature and quantity of contraband. Sellers face even harsher penalties, with major black market operators subject to extended torture before public execution. Despite these risks, the black market thrives because official channels provide inadequate sustenance and workers require anything, to make their existence tolerable. Malnutrition affects the majority of the imperial population to varying degrees. The official rations provide sufficient calories to prevent starvation, but often lack complete nutritional profiles. Workers develop deficiencies in vitamins and minerals that cause a range of health problems. Scurvy remains common despite being easily preventable, causing bleeding gums and weakened bones. Rickets affects children whose diets lack sufficient vitamin D, leaving them with deformed skeletons. Anemia is nearly universal among lower-class workers, producing constant fatigue and weakness that compounds the difficulty of their labor. The administratum tracks these conditions only when they impact production metrics, providing supplements when deficiencies reach levels that significantly reduce worker output. Disease spreads easily through densely packed imperial populations living in unsanitary conditions. Respiratory infections pass through hab blocks in waves, killing the very young and very old while leaving workers sick but functional. Gastrointestinal diseases caused by contaminated food or water produce cycles of illness that workers simply endure, continuing their labor while suffering from dysentery or food poisoning. Skin conditions caused by chemical exposure or parasitic infections cover workers' bodies in rashes and lesions that never fully heal. The administratum provides minimal medical care, focusing on conditions that directly impact work capability. A broken bone might receive treatment because it prevents labor. A chronic infection that leaves a worker functional receives nothing. Life expectancy varies significantly by world classification and social position. On hive worlds, workers in the lower and middle levels average 30 to 45 years of life expectancy. The combination of toxic air, dangerous working conditions, inadequate nutrition, and lack of medical care ensures most workers die well before reaching what would be considered old age in more favorable conditions. Those who survive into their 40s often do so with bodies broken by decades of hard labor, their joints destroyed by repetitive motion, their lungs scarred by chemical exposure, their organs failing from accumulated toxins. These elderly workers continue laboring until they physically cannot, at which point they either die at their stations or are processed for corpse starch. Agri-world populations fare somewhat better, with life expectancies ranging from 40 to 55 years. The access to fresher food, even if limited, and outdoor work that provides natural light and air improves overall health compared to hive worlds. However, agricultural work carries its own hazards. Heavy machinery causes frequent injuries. Exposure to pesticides and other agricultural chemicals produces long-term health effects. The physical demands of constant field labor wear down bodies just as surely as manufactorum work. Elderly agricultural workers develop distinctive profiles, their bodies bent from years of stooping labor, their hands gnarled from operating equipment, their skin weathered by constant exposure to whatever passes for sunlight on their world. Forge world populations suffer the shortest life expectancies outside of death worlds, averaging 25 to 40 years. The extreme pollution, constant chemical exposure, and high rates of industrial accidents create environments where simply breathing reduces lifespan. Workers on forge worlds like Ryza or Greya inhale toxic particulates with every breath, their lungs gradually filling with metal dust and chemical residues. The water is more contaminated despite reclamation efforts. The food contains higher levels of industrial byproducts. Even the radiation levels are elevated from the massive power generation systems required to run planetary-scale manufacturing. Workers who reach their 30s on forge worlds are considered elderly, their bodies aged far beyond their years by the relentless assault of industrial toxins. The housing crisis in the Imperium is not a crisis at all, because that would imply something abnormal or temporary. The conditions in which billions live represent the standard, the expected, the permanent state of imperial existence. On Necromunda, the archetypal hive world, a single hab block tower might house 2 million people in a structure that rises 3 kilometers into the toxic atmosphere. These towers, built during the dark age of technology or the Great Crusade, were never designed for current population densities. What were once spacious apartments for hundreds have been subdivided, walled off, and crammed with thousands. The administratum maintains records showing official occupancy limits, but these numbers bear no relationship to reality. A hab unit officially rated for 4 people routinely houses 15 or 20. The typical mid-hive hab unit measures approximately 4 meters by 5 meters, a single room that serves as bedroom, living space, kitchen, and everything else for an entire family. The ceiling height varies by level and tower age, ranging from barely 2 meters in the oldest sections to perhaps 3 meters in newer construction. Families arrange their living space with brutal efficiency born of necessity. Sleeping mats stack against walls during waking hours. A small cooking surface, usually just a heating element powered by the building's erratic electrical system, occupies one corner. Personal possessions are minimal because there is simply nowhere to put them. A family of 12 might own collectively what could fit in a single large trunk: changes of clothing, a few cooking implements, perhaps a small shrine to the emperor, and whatever tools are required for their work assignments. The sleeping arrangements in these units defy any concept of privacy or personal space. Families sleep in shifts corresponding to their work schedules, with perhaps 6 people sleeping while 6 others are at the manufactorums. The sleeping mats lie so close together that movement requires stepping over bodies. Children sleep 3 or 4 to a mat, pressed against each other for warmth when the heating systems fail, which they do regularly. Married couples have no privacy for intimacy, conducting their relations while others pretend to sleep or simply ignore what happens an arm's length away. This complete lack of privacy extends to every bodily function, every argument, every moment of grief or joy. The concept of a private moment becomes alien to Hab block residents, forgotten within a generation. Communal facilities serve entire floors or sections of Hab blocks, with hundreds of people sharing the same toilets, washing stations, and waste disposal systems. A typical communal facility on a mid-hive level consists of a large room containing perhaps 20 toilet stalls, most lacking doors, and a washing area with cold water taps that function sporadically. The toilets connect to waste reclamation systems that process sewage for water extraction and organic matter recovery. When these systems function properly, waste disappears down pipes to processing facilities deep in the hive's foundations. When they fail, which occurs frequently, sewage backs up into the communal facilities and sometimes into the Hab units themselves. Residents then live with standing sewage until repair crews arrive, which might take days or weeks depending on the severity of other maintenance issues competing for attention. The washing facilities provide only cold water and no privacy. Workers strip and wash communally, standing shoulder to shoulder while using harsh chemical soap that removes grime but leaves skin raw and irritated. Hot water is a luxury reserved for upper hive levels, where the wealthy and administratively important reside. The washing areas become social spaces by necessity, places where information spreads, alliances form, and the social hierarchy of the Hab block establishes itself. Fights break out over perceived slights or actual theft of soap and clothing. The strongest claim the best positions near functioning taps. The weakest make do with whatever remains. Vertical stratification defines hive city existence more than any other single factor. Height equals privilege, wealth, and power in a direct and measurable way. The principle is simple. The higher you live, the better your conditions. At the absolute bottom in the underhive exist the dregs of imperial society, those who have fallen through every safety net or never had access to nets in the first place. The underhive occupies the original ground level of the hive city and the ancient structures that predate current construction, now buried under kilometers of subsequent building. Here, no official authority operates. The Adeptus Arbites gave up patrolling these levels centuries or millennia ago, ceding control to gangs, mutant tribes, and worse things that lurk in the darkness. Underhive habitation consists of whatever shelter can be improvised from the ruins of previous civilizations. Families occupy collapsed buildings, sealing off sections with scavenged metal and ancient plasteel sheets. They build shanties in the shadows of massive support pillars that hold up the hive above, constructing walls from corrugated metal, broken machinery, and compacted refuse. These dwellings offer no protection from the toxic runoff that drips constantly from above, no insulation from temperature extremes, no security from the predators, both human and otherwise, that hunt in the darkness. An underhive dwelling might be a single room carved from rubble, its entrance hidden behind false walls to avoid detection by raiders. It might be a tent made from tarpaulins stretched between rusted girders. It might be nothing more than a sleeping spot claimed in a tunnel, defended with violence against others seeking the same space. The environmental conditions in the underhive make it nearly uninhabitable by any reasonable standard, yet millions survive there through sheer desperation and adaptation. The air is thick with chemical vapors from industrial runoff, spores from the massive fungal blooms that grow in the darkness, and particulates from the constant decay of ancient structures. Breathing this atmosphere causes immediate irritation to lungs and eyes, and long-term exposure produces mutations, cancers, and organ failure. The water that collects in underhive pools and streams flows down from the hive above, carrying dissolved chemicals, heavy metals, and biological waste. This water is toxic without treatment, yet underhive dwellers drink it because no alternative exists. They develop partial immunity to some contaminants through generations of exposure, but the water still kills. Children particularly suffer, their developing bodies unable to process the toxin load. Industrial waste accumulates in vast pools and rivers in the underhive, creating landscapes of chemical sludge and toxic sediment. Promethium runoff forms lakes that occasionally ignite, sending walls of flame through underhive settlements and incinerating everything in their path. Heavy metal contamination leaves areas where the ground itself is poisonous, where touching bare earth causes chemical burns. Radioactive waste from ancient reactors creates zones of high radiation that kill within hours of exposure. Underhive residents learn to identify these hazards through hard experience, developing mental maps of safe routes and deadly zones. They mark dangerous areas with crude symbols and warnings, though new arrivals often ignore these signs and die as a result. The mutant tribes of the Underhive represent humanity adapted to this toxic environment through uncontrolled genetic drift. These populations have lived in the Underhive for so many generations that they have diverged significantly from baseline human genetics. Some mutations are subtle: increased resistance to specific toxins, enhanced night vision, or redundant organs that provide backup when primary systems fail. Other mutations are obvious and grotesque: extra limbs, malformed faces, bodies that barely resemble human anymore. The Imperium officially condemns all mutants as abominations deserving only death, but in the Underhive, mutation is simply survival. The mutant tribes control territories in the deepest levels, areas so contaminated that unmutated humans cannot survive. They raid up into the lower hive for supplies and captives, then retreat to depths where pursuers cannot follow. The creatures that inhabit the Underhive alongside humans range from merely dangerous to nightmare incarnate. Giant rats the size of dogs hunt in packs, their bodies adapted to digest almost anything organic and many things that are not. These vermin spread disease and kill the weak, but they also provide food for Underhive dwellers desperate enough to hunt them. The meat is stringy and often toxic, but it provides protein that corpse starch rations do not. More dangerous are the things that should not exist: gene stealers that infiltrated the hive decades or centuries ago and now breed in the darkness, their hybrid offspring appearing almost human until they reveal their true nature. Occasionally, creatures from the warp manifest in areas where the barrier between reality and the immaterium grows thin, drawn by the suffering and death that permeates the Underhive. Moving up from the Underhive, the lower hive levels represent marginal improvement at best. Here, official authority exists in theory, with Adeptus Arbites patrols occurring sporadically and administratum records acknowledging the population. The housing improves from improvised shelters to actual structures, though calling them adequate would be generous. Lower hive hab blocks are the oldest still functioning residential structures, built centuries ago and maintained only enough to prevent complete collapse. The walls leak, the ceilings sag, the floors are uneven from settling and structural damage. Entire sections are condemned but still occupied because residents have nowhere else to go. A lower hive hab unit might measure 3 meters by 4 meters and house 8 to 10 people. The building systems function intermittently at best. Electrical power comes and goes on schedules that seem random, but actually reflect the power grid's prioritization of more important areas. Water flows for a few hours each day, requiring residents to collect and store what they need in whatever containers they can scavenge. Heating is non-existent in most lower hive blocks. Residents burn whatever they can find for warmth: scavenged wood, compressed fungus, occasionally furniture or sections of their own walls when desperation sets in. The smoke from thousands of small fires fills the lower hive levels, adding to the already poor air quality. The mid-hive represents the standard of living for the majority of imperial citizens on hive worlds, the level where most manufactorum workers and their families reside. Conditions here are terrible by any objective measure, but represent relative comfort compared to levels below. The hab blocks are maintained regularly enough that catastrophic failures are uncommon rather than constant. The units themselves are cramped and overcrowded, but have functioning doors, intact walls, and ceilings that do not actively threaten to collapse. Electrical power is reliable most of the time. Water flows on predictable schedules. The communal facilities are overcrowded and unsanitary but functional. Mid-hive residents develop elaborate social structures around their living conditions, creating informal hierarchies based on seniority, family size, and work status. A family that has occupied the same unit for 3 generations commands more respect than newcomers. Workers in essential industries receive better treatment than those in less critical roles. These social dynamics play out in the communal facilities, in the queues for water and rations, and in the countless small interactions that make up daily life. Violence is common but usually restrained, as residents understand that killing neighbors brings unwanted attention from authorities. Beatings and intimidation serve to enforce social norms and settle disputes. The upper hive exists as an almost mythical realm to lower-level residents, a place where the wealthy and powerful live in conditions that approach actual comfort. These levels receive priority for all services. The air is filtered and actually breathable. The water is cleaner. The hab units are spacious by hive standards, perhaps offering separate rooms for sleeping and living. Some upper hive residences even have private sanitation facilities, an unimaginable luxury to those below. The residents of these levels are guild masters, senior administratum officials, successful merchants, and others who have accumulated enough wealth and influence to escape the worst of hive existence. They still live in a hive city, still breathe recycled air and drink reclaimed water, but their experience differs so dramatically from lower levels that they might as well inhabit different worlds. Agri-world housing follows different patterns, shaped by the needs of agricultural production rather than industrial manufacture. Workers live in barracks complexes scattered across the vast farming regions, structures that house hundreds or thousands in dormitory-style accommodations. A typical barracks consists of a long building with rows of bunks, perhaps 50 or 100 per room, with minimal space between them. Workers sleep in shifts corresponding to planting and harvest schedules, which vary by crop and season. During peak periods, the barracks are never empty, with some workers sleeping while others are in the fields. The barracks offer no privacy and few amenities. Workers store their possessions in small lockers at the foot of their bunks. Communal facilities are basic: large shower rooms with cold water, toilet blocks that serve hundreds, and mess halls where workers receive their rations. The buildings themselves are purely functional, constructed from prefabricated materials designed for rapid assembly and minimal maintenance. They leak when it rains. They are freezing in winter and sweltering in summer. They provide shelter and nothing more. Workers spend as little time in the barracks as possible, preferring the fields despite the hard labor, because at least there they can see the sky. Forge World dormitories represent the Adeptus Mechanicus approach to housing, which treats biological workers as components requiring specific maintenance conditions. The dormitories are vast structures attached directly to manufactorum complexes, allowing workers to move from sleeping quarters to workstations with minimal transit time. The sleeping areas consist of rows of pods, each barely large enough for a single person to lie down. These pods stack 4 or 5 high, accessed by ladders, and provide just enough space for a worker to sleep. The pods contain basic life support, filtered air, temperature regulation set to optimal levels for human function rather than comfort, and automated systems that wake workers at designated times by flooding the pod with harsh light and loud tones. The Mechanicus maintains these facilities with the same precision they apply to machinery maintenance. Cleaning servitors scrub the dormitories on regular schedules. Air filtration systems operate continuously, removing contaminants but also any trace of natural atmosphere. The water and washing facilities is precisely temperature controlled and rationed to exact amounts. Everything functions according to specifications, but the specifications were written for maintaining biological components, not providing comfortable living conditions. Workers in Forge World dormitories describe feeling like parts in a machine, which accurately reflects how the Mechanicus views them. Void station compartments present unique challenges due to the constraints of space-based habitation. Every cubic meter must serve a purpose, and housing receives only the minimum allocation necessary to keep crews functional. A typical crew compartment on a void station measures perhaps 2 meters by 3 meters and houses 4 to 6 people. The bunks are built into the walls, stacked 3 high, and are barely long enough for an average adult. Storage space consists of small lockers welded to the bulkheads. The compartments share life support with the rest of the station, meaning air quality depends on the overall system's function. When recyclers fail or become overloaded, the air grows stale and thin, leaving residents gasping and developing headaches from oxygen deprivation. The lack of gravity on many void stations creates additional complications for habitation. Sleeping requires securing oneself to the bunk to avoid floating away. Personal items must be attached to surfaces or they drift and become hazards. The communal facilities are designed for zero-gravity use, with suction systems for waste disposal and water that must be carefully controlled to prevent it from forming dangerous floating globules. Residents adapt to these conditions over time, but newcomers struggle with the disorientation and physical discomfort of living without gravity. Frontier colony settlements offer conditions that might seem preferable to hive or forge worlds, but this relative advantage is marginal and comes with different hazards. A colonial settlement might consist of prefabricated hab units arranged in defensive perimeters, each unit housing a single family in something approaching privacy. The units have separate rooms, private sanitation, and access to outdoor spaces. However, colonial worlds face constant threats from hostile environments, native predators, and sometimes xenos attacks. The settlements exist in a state of siege, with residents armed and ready to defend against threats that could annihilate them at any moment. The better living conditions are compensation for the very real possibility of violent death. Sanitation across imperial worlds operates on principles of minimal adequacy and maximum recycling. The waste disposal systems collect sewage from communal facilities and hab units, processing it through treatment plants that extract water and organic compounds for reuse. The solid waste undergoes rendering similar to corpse starch processing, breaking down biological material into components that can be repurposed. Nothing is wasted because nothing can be wasted when supporting populations in the billions. The systems work adequately when maintained and supplied with necessary chemicals and power. When they fail, sewage backs up into living areas, creating health hazards that kill thousands before repairs are completed. Disease vectors thrive in imperial housing conditions. The overcrowding ensures that respiratory infections spread rapidly through entire hab blocks. The inadequate sanitation creates perfect conditions for waterborne diseases. The vermin infestations provide hosts for parasites and disease-carrying insects. Outbreaks occur regularly, killing the weak and leaving survivors with permanent health damage. The Administratum tracks major outbreaks and responds when diseases threaten to impact production significantly. Minor outbreaks that kill only a few thousand are ignored as acceptable losses. Plague outbreaks represent the nightmare scenario that authorities actually fear. Infections that spread so rapidly and kill so efficiently that they threaten entire hive populations. When plague strikes, the response is immediate and brutal. The Adeptus Arbites quarantine affected areas, sealing bulkheads and welding shut access points to prevent escape. Everyone inside the quarantine zone is considered already dead. The Inquisition arrives to determine if the plague has natural or supernatural origins. If the latter, they order exterminatus protocols. If the former, they simply wait for everyone in the quarantine zone to die, then send in servitors to incinerate the bodies and sterilize the area. Millions might die in these purges, but the authorities consider this acceptable to prevent billions of deaths from uncontrolled plague. The Adeptus Administratum does not merely govern the Imperium, it strangles it with red tape, drowns it in forms, and crushes it beneath mountains of documentation that serve no purpose beyond their own perpetuation. Every aspect of imperial life requires paperwork, and the loss of that paperwork can mean anything from mild inconvenience to summary execution. A citizen without proper documentation is not a citizen at all but an unperson, someone who officially does not exist and therefore has no rights, no protections, and no value beyond whatever their body might contribute to the corpse starch facilities. Work permits constitute the most fundamental documentation any imperial citizen possesses. These documents, issued by local administratum offices and updated regularly, authorize the bearer to perform specific labor in designated locations. A manufactorum worker on Armageddon carries a work permit that specifies their facility assignment, their shift schedule, their labor classification, and their production quotas. Without this permit, the worker cannot enter their workplace. The Adeptus Arbites stationed at Manufactorum gates check permits at every shift change, scanning the documents for authenticity markers and cross-referencing them against central databases. A worker who arrives without their permit is turned away, losing a day's wages and rations. A worker who loses their permit entirely faces weeks or months of bureaucratic procedures to obtain a replacement, during which time they cannot work and therefore cannot eat. The replacement process for lost work permits demonstrates the administratum's approach to all documentation. The worker must first file a loss report at their local administratum office, a process that requires waiting in queues that can stretch for entire days. The offices operate on schedules that seem designed to maximize inconvenience, opening for only a few hours daily and closing without warning when clerks decide they have processed sufficient petitions. Once the worker reaches a clerk, they must provide testimony about how the permit was lost, witness statements from other citizens confirming the loss, and payment of replacement fees that consume whatever savings the worker might have accumulated. The clerk then files the paperwork, which enters a processing system that moves at speeds measured in weeks or months rather than days. Travel papers represent another critical form of documentation, required for any movement beyond a citizen's designated residential district. The Imperium restricts population movement with obsessive thoroughness, tracking every citizen's location and requiring authorization for any deviation from established patterns. A worker who lives in one hab block and works in a specific manufactorum has an approved travel route between these locations. Deviating from this route, even to take a different street, technically violates their travel authorization. In practice, minor deviations are ignored, but any significant movement requires proper documentation. A worker who needs to visit a Medicaid facility in a different district must obtain a travel chit from their local administratum office, specifying the destination, the route, the purpose, and the duration of the journey. Inter-city travel requires even more extensive documentation. A citizen seeking to move from one hive city to another on the same planet must petition the administratum months in advance, providing justification for the journey and proof of authorization from authorities at the destination. The petition moves through multiple levels of bureaucratic review, with each clerk adding their own stamps and notations before passing it upward. The entire process can take a year or more, during which the petitioner must continue their normal life while waiting for approval that may never come. Many petitions are simply denied without explanation, the months of waiting resulting in a single stamped rejection that offers no recourse or appeal. Planetary travel, moving from one world to another, is so heavily restricted that most imperial citizens never seriously consider it. The documentation requirements are Byzantine in their complexity, requiring not just travel authorization, but proof of employment at the destination, verification of housing arrangements, clearance from the Adeptus Arbites confirming no criminal record, genetic purity certification, loyalty oaths witnessed by ecclesiarchy officials, and payment of fees that exceed what most workers earn in years. The entire process can take decades, and approval rates hover near single digits. Those who do receive authorization typically do so because their skills are needed elsewhere, not because they desired to travel. A skilled tech right might be transferred to a different forge world, but this transfer is compulsory rather than voluntary. Ration chits control access to food and water, functioning as a parallel currency that cannot be saved or accumulated. Each citizen receives daily or weekly chits based on their work classification and family size, and these chits must be exchanged for rations at designated distribution centers within specific time windows. A chit not used within its validity period becomes worthless, ensuring citizens cannot stockpile rations or build any kind of food security. The chits themselves are printed on cheap paper or thin plasteel, marked with authenticity stamps that change regularly to prevent counterfeiting. Losing ration chits means going hungry until the next distribution, and the administratum does not issue replacements for lost chits, because doing so would require additional paperwork and verification, procedures that the system cannot accommodate. HAB assignments determine where citizens are permitted to live, and these assignments are treated with the same bureaucratic rigidity as work permits. A family assigned to a specific HAB unit in a specific block cannot simply move to a different unit, even within the same building, without filing change of residence forms and waiting for approval. The forms require justification for the requested move, documentation of the current living situation, verification that the new unit is available and appropriately sized for the family, and payment of processing fees. The entire procedure takes months at minimum, and many requests are denied because the administratum's housing allocation algorithms determined that the current assignment is optimal according to criteria that no one outside the administratum understands. The consequences of lost documentation extend far beyond inconvenience. A citizen without proper papers becomes vulnerable to immediate arrest by the adeptus arbites, who patrol constantly looking for violations of imperial law. An undocumented person can be detained indefinitely while the arbites attempt to verify their identity and legal status. This verification process moves slowly because it requires accessing administratum databases that are notoriously incomplete and poorly maintained. A detained citizen might spend months in holding cells while clerks search for their records, and if those records cannot be found, the citizen faces a grim choice: servitor conversion or execution. Servitor conversion represents the Imperium's solution to the problem of undocumented persons and convicted criminals. The process involves extensive surgery that removes most of the subject's higher brain functions, leaving only enough neural tissue to perform basic tasks. The subject's body is then augmented with mechanical components appropriate to their intended function: lifting servos for labor units, weapon mounts for combat servitors, or specialized tools for technical work. The resulting creature is neither fully human nor fully machine, but something in between, a biological robot that follows programmed instructions without question or complaint. The Imperium produces millions of servitors annually, and a significant percentage come from citizens who lost their documentation and could not prove their legal existence. Dealing with the Adeptus Administratum directly is an experience that breaks spirits more effectively than any physical torture. The Administratum offices that exist in every imperial city are vast bureaucratic complexes where thousands of clerks process forms according to procedures that have remained unchanged for centuries or millennia. The offices are deliberately intimidating, with high ceilings, long corridors lined with filing cabinets, and reception areas where petitioners wait on hard benches for hours or days. The clerks sit behind reinforced glass or metal screens, protected from the masses they serve, and communicate through speaker grills that distort voices and make understanding difficult. The petition process for any administratum service follows established protocols that prioritize procedure over efficiency. A citizen seeking to resolve any issue must first obtain the correct petition form, which requires knowing the specific form designation from among thousands of possibilities. The forms themselves are not freely available, but must be requested from form distribution clerks, who dispense them only after verifying that the petitioner has legitimate need. Once obtained, the form must be completed in precise detail, with any errors or omissions resulting in automatic rejection. The completed form is then submitted to receiving clerks, who stamp it with a submission date and file it in the appropriate processing queue. The queues move at speeds that defy rational explanation. A simple request, such as updating a residential address, might take 3 months to process. A complex petition, such as requesting exemption from a work assignment due to medical reasons, can take years. The petitioner receives no updates on their petition's status and cannot inquire about progress without filing additional forms requesting status updates, which themselves require processing time. Many petitioners simply give up, accepting their situations rather than continuing to navigate the bureaucratic maze. This is not accidental. The system is designed to be so frustrating and time-consuming that only the most desperate or determined citizens persist. Corruption permeates the administratum at every level, with clerks and officials extracting bribes to expedite processing or ensure favorable outcomes. A clerk might process a petition in days rather than months if the petitioner provides appropriate compensation. The bribes range from small amounts of imperial currency for minor services to substantial payments for major approvals. The system operates openly, with clerks making their expectations clear through subtle hints and meaningful pauses during interactions. A clerk might mention that they are working through a particularly large backlog, then pause significantly while looking at the petitioner. The message is clear: payment will reduce that backlog, at least for this specific petition. The bribe economy creates a parallel system where those with resources can navigate bureaucracy efficiently while the poor remain trapped in endless waiting. A wealthy merchant seeking travel authorization might pay bribes at each processing level, moving their petition to the top of every queue and receiving approval in weeks rather than years. A poor worker seeking the same authorization cannot afford these payments and must wait through the standard process, which may take so long that the original reason for travel becomes moot. This disparity is accepted as normal, another aspect of imperial life where wealth and influence determine outcomes. Scriveners, specialized clerks who handle complex documentation and legal filings, occupy a unique position in the administratum hierarchy. These individuals possess extensive knowledge of imperial bureaucratic procedures and can guide petitioners through the most complicated processes. They charge substantial fees for their services, but for those who can afford them, scriveners provide invaluable assistance. A scrivener knows which forms are required for any given situation, how to complete them correctly, which clerks are most amenable to bribes, and how to navigate the appeals processes when petitions are denied. They maintain networks of contacts within the administratum and can sometimes resolve issues that would be impossible for ordinary citizens to handle. The tithe system represents the administratum's primary function, collecting resources from every imperial world to fuel the Imperium's military and administrative apparatus. Each world receives tithe assessments that specify what must be provided to the Imperium, and these assessments are enforced with absolute ruthlessness. The tithes come in various forms depending on the world's classification and capabilities. Hive worlds provide manufactured goods and conscripts for the Imperial Guard. Agri-worlds provide food. Forge worlds provide weapons and equipment. Mining worlds provide raw materials. Every world provides psychers, those unfortunate individuals born with psychic abilities who must be collected and shipped to Terra for evaluation and processing. The guard tithe is perhaps the most visible and traumatic form of imperial taxation. The Adeptus Munitorum sets recruitment quotas for each world based on population and strategic needs, and these quotas must be met regardless of local circumstances. A world might receive a tithe demand for 1 million soldiers, and that world must provide 1 million soldiers within the specified timeframe. The administratum does not care if the world is experiencing famine, plague, or economic collapse. The tithe must be paid. Local authorities conduct mass conscriptions, dragging young men and women from their homes and workplaces, processing them through basic medical screenings, and shipping them off-world to training facilities or directly to war zones. The conscription process is brutal and arbitrary. Adeptus Arbites and local enforcers conduct sweeps through residential districts, checking documentation and selecting individuals who meet basic physical requirements. A young worker might be walking to their manufactorum shift when enforcers grab them, verify they fall within the conscription age range, and load them onto transport vehicles bound for processing centers. The conscript has no right to refuse, no opportunity to settle their affairs, no chance to say goodbye to family. They simply disappear into the Imperial Guard's vast machine, becoming one of countless billions serving in wars across the galaxy. Material tithes require worlds to provide specific quantities of goods or resources according to administratum assessments. A forge world might be required to produce 50 million lasguns annually. An agri-world might owe 10 billion tons of grain. A mining world might need to extract and refine specific quantities of rare minerals. These quotas are set by administratum officials who may have never visited the worlds they are assessing, working from data that might be decades or centuries out of date. The quotas often bear no relationship to a world's actual productive capacity, but this does not matter. The tithe must be paid. Worlds that cannot meet their tithes face severe consequences. The administratum can increase future tithe assessments as punishment for failure, creating a spiral where falling short once makes future compliance even more difficult. The Adeptus Arbites can conduct investigations into why the tithe was not met, looking for corruption or incompetence among local authorities. In extreme cases, the Administratum can request inquisitorial intervention, which typically results in mass executions of planetary leadership and their replacement with officials who will ensure compliance. The threat of these consequences drives planetary governors and administrators to meet tithes by any means necessary, even if doing so destroys their world's economy or starves their population. The psyker tithe operates under different rules because psykers represent both a resource and a threat. Individuals born with psychic abilities must be identified and collected before their powers manifest uncontrollably, potentially opening rifts to the warp and causing demonic incursions. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica maintains the black ships that travel between worlds collecting psykers, and every world must surrender those identified within their population. Local authorities conduct regular screenings, using sanctioned psykers or specialized equipment to detect psychic potential in children and adults. Those identified are taken by force, regardless of their families' protests or their own desires. The collected psykers are transported to Terra in the black ship's holds, conditions that kill many before they arrive. Those who survive face evaluation by the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, which determines their fate. The strongest and most stable become sanctioned psykers, serving the Imperium as astropaths, battle psykers, or in other roles requiring psychic abilities. The weak or unstable are either executed or fed to the Golden Throne, their life force consumed to maintain the Emperor's psychic beacon that allows warp travel. The psyker tithe is non-negotiable, and worlds that attempt to hide psykers face inquisitorial investigation and potential exterminatus. Census operations occur periodically, with Administratum officials conducting population counts and updating records on planetary populations. These operations are massive undertakings involving thousands of clerks and enforcers who move through cities and settlements recording every citizen. The census serves multiple purposes: verifying tithe compliance, identifying potential conscripts, detecting undocumented populations, and updating the Administratum's demographic databases. For ordinary citizens, census operations mean mandatory participation in verification procedures that can take days, during which normal life stops completely. The census team set up processing stations in each district, requiring every citizen to present themselves for documentation review and updating. Citizens queue for hours or days, waiting to reach the processing desks where clerks verify their identities, update their records, and issue new documentation. The process is exhaustive, with clerks recording employment status, family composition, residential location, and any changes since the last census. Citizens who cannot provide proper documentation face immediate detention while their status is investigated. Those found to be undocumented are arrested and typically processed for servitor conversion. The visits from Administratum census officials carry an additional terror because these officials have authority to reclassify entire districts for optimization. The Administratum constantly seeks to improve efficiency in resource allocation and population management, and census operations provide opportunities to implement these improvements. An official might determine that a residential district would be more efficiently used for industrial purposes, resulting in the entire population being relocated to make room for new manufactorums. The residents have no say in this decision and receive minimal assistance in their forced relocation. They must abandon their homes, taking only what they can carry, and move to whatever new hab assignments the Administratum provides. District reclassification can also mean changes to labor assignments for entire populations. An Administratum official might decide that a district's workers are poorly allocated, with too many performing low-priority tasks while high-priority industries lack sufficient labor. The official can order mass reassignments, transferring thousands of workers from their current positions to new ones regardless of their skills, experience, or preferences. A worker who has spent 20 years in a specific manufactorum might suddenly find themselves reassigned to a completely different industry, forced to learn new skills or face punishment for failing to meet production quotas in their new position. The optimization visits sometimes result in population culling, euphemistically termed demographic adjustment. If census data shows that a district contains too many elderly, disabled, or otherwise non-productive individuals, administratum officials can order these populations removed. The removal process is clinical and efficient. Enforcers round up those designated for removal, load them onto transports, and take them to processing facilities. The official records state these individuals are being relocated to specialized care facilities or retirement communities. The reality is that most are processed for corpse starch or converted into servitors. The remaining population learns not to ask questions about where their elderly or disabled neighbors went. The morning prayer shift begins at 400 hours in the manufactorums of Armageddon, mandatory attendance enforced by overseers who carry shock mauls and maintain lists of workers who fail to appear. The workers file into designated prayer halls, vast spaces carved from the manufactorum floor that can hold thousands, their walls lined with picked screens displaying images of the God Emperor in various martial poses. The prayer sessions last 2 hours, cutting directly into what would otherwise be rest periods between shifts. Workers stand in formation, their bodies already exhausted from 16-hour shifts, and recite the approved litanies while preachers patrol the aisles looking for signs of insufficient devotion. The prayers themselves follow strict formats established by the ecclesiarchy and vary only slightly between different imperial worlds. The litany of devotion must be recited at the start of every shift. The prayer of production asks the emperor's blessing on the day's labor. The Catechism of Hate reminds workers of humanity's enemies and the necessity of constant vigilance. A worker who stumbles over the words receives immediate correction from the preachers, usually a shock maul strike to the back or legs. A worker who appears to be merely mouthing the words without proper fervor faces more severe punishment, possibly including public flogging or reassignment to more dangerous work details. The overseers maintain records of each worker's devotional performance, and these records factor into ration allocations and hab assignment decisions. The integration of religious observance into work schedules means that imperial citizens experience no separation between their labor and their worship. The two activities blend into a single continuous act of service to the emperor. On hive worlds like Necromunda, workers recite prayers while operating their machinery, the words becoming automatic responses timed to the rhythm of production. A worker assembling lasgun components might recite the prayer of the weapon with each completed unit, the prayer taking exactly as long as the assembly process. This synchronization is not accidental, but deliberately designed by ecclesiarchy efficiency experts who studied production rates and crafted prayers to match. Prayer shifts occur multiple times throughout the standard work period, breaking up the labor at intervals determined by ministorum officials rather than any concern for worker welfare. A typical manufactorum schedule includes morning prayers before the shift begins, midday prayers that replace what might otherwise be meal breaks, and evening prayers that extend the workday by several hours. Workers eat their rations while standing in prayer formation, the food consumption itself accompanied by the prayer of sustenance that thanks the emperor for providing nourishment through corpse starch and nutri paste. The act of eating becomes a religious ritual, with workers required to maintain proper devotional posture even while consuming their meager rations. The architecture of imperial faith dominates every settlement, from the smallest agri-world village to the largest hive city. Cathedrals rise above the manufactorums and hab blocks, massive structures that dwarf everything around them and serve as constant reminders of the emperor's presence. On Ophelia 7, one of the ecclesiarchy's cardinal worlds, the Cathedral of St. Asperoi stretches 15 kilometers in length and rises 3 kilometers into the atmosphere. Its construction consumed the labor of 10 million workers over 2 centuries, with thousands dying during the building process from falls, exhaustion, and industrial accidents. The cathedral's interior can hold 500,000 worshippers simultaneously, its nave lined with statues of imperial saints and its ceiling painted with scenes of the emperor's victories during the Great Crusade. The construction of these cathedrals follows patterns established over millennia, with each new structure required to surpass previous ones in scale and grandeur. The ecclesiarchy views cathedral construction as acts of devotion that demonstrate a world's faith, and planetary governors who fail to authorize sufficient cathedral projects risk accusations of insufficient piety. The labor for these projects comes from the general population, with workers drafted from manufactorums and agri-complexes to serve on construction crews. This conscripted labor receives no additional compensation beyond their standard rations, and the work is often more dangerous than their regular assignments. A worker might spend years hauling stone blocks weighing several tons each, operating primitive cranes that fail regularly, or working at heights where a single misstep means death. The materials for cathedral construction are sourced through the same tithe system that supplies everything else in the Imperium, but the ecclesiarchy receives priority allocation that supersedes other needs. A world experiencing famine might still be required to divert resources to cathedral construction, with the ecclesiarchy arguing that spiritual nourishment takes precedence over physical sustenance. The stone comes from quarries where workers labor in conditions that make standard manufactorum work seem pleasant by comparison. The quarries operate continuously, with crews working in shifts that blur together into endless cycles of cutting, hauling, and loading stone. The dust from stone cutting fills workers' lungs, causing respiratory diseases that kill within years. The heavy lifting destroys backs and joints. The quarry overseers maintain production through the same methods used everywhere in the Imperium: threats, violence, and the promise of corpse starch processing for those who fail to meet quotas. Shrines exist in every manufactorum, smaller versions of the great cathedrals that serve as focal points for daily worship. These shrines occupy spaces on the production floor itself, alcoves carved from the walls and filled with religious iconography. A typical shrine contains a statue or picked image of the emperor, candles that burn continuously, and offerings left by workers seeking the emperor's blessing. The shrines are maintained by lay preachers, workers who have demonstrated sufficient devotion to earn this additional duty. These individuals lead prayers during shift changes, accept offerings from their fellow workers, and report signs of insufficient faith to the ecclesiarchy authorities. The offerings at manufactorum shrines consist of whatever workers can spare from their meager possessions. A worker might leave a portion of their rations, burning the corpse starch in the shrine's candles as an offering. Another might leave a small personal item, perhaps a piece of jewelry inherited from a parent or a tool they crafted themselves. The most valued offerings are drops of blood, with workers cutting their palms and letting the blood drip onto the shrine's altar while reciting prayers for the emperor's protection. The ecclesiarchy teaches that these blood offerings demonstrate true devotion, and workers who make regular blood offerings receive favorable notation in their devotional records. The aquila symbol appears everywhere in imperial settlements, stamped on walls, carved into machinery, emblazoned on uniforms, and tattooed on skin. The two-headed eagle represents the emperor's dominion over both the material and spiritual realms, and its presence serves as a constant reminder of his watchfulness. On hive worlds, massive aquila symbols are painted on the sides of hab blocks, some large enough to be visible from kilometers away. The symbols are maintained by specialized crews who repaint them regularly, ensuring they remain visible despite the pollution and grime that coats everything. Workers pass beneath these symbols dozens of times daily, and many develop the habit of making the sign of the aquila whenever they do so, touching their hands to their foreheads in the approved gesture of devotion. The ecclesiarchy enforces proper aquila display through regular inspections conducted by wandering preachers and confessors. These officials examine manufactorums and hab blocks for signs of insufficient religious observance, checking that aquila symbols are properly maintained, that shrines are adequately supplied, and that workers demonstrate appropriate devotion. An inspector might enter a manufactorum unannounced and demand that workers recite specific prayers from memory. Those who fail face immediate punishment, ranging from public flogging to reassignment to penal work details. The inspections create an atmosphere of constant anxiety, with workers never knowing when they might be tested on their devotional knowledge. Preachers occupy a unique position in imperial society, serving as the ecclesiarchy's primary interface with the general population. These individuals range from minor lay preachers who lead prayers in manufactorums to cardinal-level officials who command the faith of entire sectors. The preachers who interact most directly with ordinary citizens are typically drawn from the working classes themselves, individuals who demonstrated exceptional devotion and were elevated to positions of religious authority. They receive training in ecclesiarchy doctrine, learn the approved prayers and catechisms, and are granted authority to enforce orthodoxy among their communities. The street preachers of hive worlds like Necromunda operate with considerable autonomy, establishing themselves in public spaces and delivering sermons to whoever will listen. These individuals are often former workers who experienced religious visions or demonstrated unusual devotion, and they preach with the fervor of true believers. Their sermons focus on humanity's enemies, the necessity of constant vigilance against heresy, and the promise of the Emperor's reward for the faithful after death. They describe the afterlife in vivid terms, painting pictures of paradise where the faithful sit at the Emperor's side while heretics burn in eternal torment. The crowds that gather for these sermons often number in the hundreds or thousands, workers seeking some meaning in their brutal existence. Confessors represent the ecclesiarchy's more aggressive approach to enforcing faith, individuals granted authority to root out heresy and punish the unfaithful. These officials travel between settlements conducting investigations into suspected heresy, examining communities for signs of religious deviation. A confessor might arrive in a manufactorum district and immediately begin questioning workers about their devotional practices, their knowledge of approved prayers, and their attitudes toward the Emperor. The questioning is intense and often accompanied by physical coercion. A confessor uses pain compliance techniques to ensure honest answers, applying shock mauls or other implements to workers who hesitate or provide unsatisfactory responses. The purity tests conducted by confessors go beyond simple doctrinal knowledge. These officials examine workers for physical signs of corruption, looking for mutations that might indicate chaos, taint, or other forms of spiritual contamination. The examinations are invasive and humiliating, with workers forced to strip and submit to thorough inspections of their bodies. A birthmark in an unusual location might be interpreted as a sign of corruption. A minor physical deformity could be evidence of mutation. The confessors operate on the principle that it is better to execute 100 innocent citizens than allow a single heretic to escape, and their investigations often result in mass executions based on the flimsiest evidence. The informant networks that support the confessor's work permeate every level of imperial society. The ecclesiarchy encourages citizens to report suspicious behavior, offering rewards for information that leads to the discovery of heresy. These rewards might include additional rations, better hab assignments, or exemptions from certain work requirements. The promise of rewards creates an atmosphere of paranoia where neighbors inform on neighbors, family members betray each other, and no one can be trusted. A worker who expresses doubt about the Emperor's divinity, even in a moment of exhaustion or despair, might find themselves reported by a colleague seeking to improve their own position. The penitent flagellants who accompany confessors on their investigations represent the ultimate expression of devotional fervor taken to self-destructive extremes. These individuals are former heretics or sinners who have been granted the opportunity to demonstrate their renewed faith through constant self-mortification. They wear robes that leave their backs exposed, and they carry barbed whips that they use on themselves continuously, tearing their flesh in acts of penance. The flagellants have often been driven mad by their experiences, their minds broken by torture or religious ecstasy, and they serve as living warnings of what awaits those who stray from the Emperor's light. The confessors use flagellants as tools for intimidation and investigation. A confessor might bring a flagellant to a prayer session and have them demonstrate their penance before the assembled workers, the sight of the flagellant's torn flesh and the sound of their prayers serving as a visceral reminder of the consequences of heresy. The flagellants are also used to extract confessions, with suspected heretics forced to watch the flagellant's self-torture while being told that similar treatment awaits them unless they confess their sins. Many innocent citizens confess to heresies They never committed simply to avoid the fate they witness in the flagellants. Missionaries represent the ecclesiarchy's outreach efforts, traveling to frontier worlds and newly discovered human populations to bring them into the imperial faith. These individuals are often fanatics who view their mission as the most important work possible, the salvation of human souls from ignorance and damnation. They arrive on worlds that have been isolated from the Imperium for centuries or millennia, populations that may have developed their own cultures and beliefs, and they work to erase those cultures and replace them with orthodox imperial faith. The missionaries use whatever methods prove necessary, from peaceful conversion through preaching to violent suppression of local religions. The missionary work on frontier worlds often involves the complete destruction of existing cultural practices. Local religious sites are demolished and replaced with imperial shrines. Traditional ceremonies are banned and practitioners executed as heretics. The missionaries work closely with Imperial Guard forces and Adeptus Arbites to enforce these changes, using military force to suppress resistance. The populations of these worlds have no choice but to accept the Imperial Creed or face extermination. The missionaries view this as necessary work, the salvation of human souls, even if the process requires the death of bodies. Religious festivals provide rare breaks from labor, though these breaks come with their own demands and dangers. The major imperial holy days include the Feast of the Emperor's Ascension, commemorating the Emperor's placement on the Golden Throne, and the Day of Redemption, celebrating humanity's survival through 10,000 years of war. These festivals are mandatory observances, with all work ceasing for the duration and all citizens required to participate in the ceremonies. The festivals typically last several days, during which workers receive no rations beyond what they can carry with them to the celebration sites. The mass pilgrimages that occur during major festivals involve millions of citizens moving through hive cities or across planetary surfaces to reach designated holy sites. On Ophelia 7, the Festival of the Ascension draws pilgrims from across the sector, with billions converging on the planet's great cathedrals. The pilgrims travel on foot, often walking for weeks to reach their destinations. They carry minimal supplies and rely on charity from communities along their routes. Many pilgrims die during these journeys from exhaustion, starvation, or simple accidents. The ecclesiarchy views these deaths as martyrdom, the pilgrims having given their lives in service to the emperor. The public executions that accompany religious festivals serve as both entertainment and instruction for the masses. The ecclesiarchy collects heretics throughout the year, holding them in detention until major festivals when they can be executed before the largest possible audiences. The executions are elaborate affairs, with the condemned paraded through streets while preachers describe their crimes and the righteous punishment they will receive. The actual executions employ various methods depending on the nature of the heresy. Burning is common for those accused of worshipping chaos, the flames symbolically purifying their corruption. Hanging is used for lesser heresies. The most severe cases involve torture before death, with the condemned subjected to hours of agony, while crowds watch and preachers lead prayers thanking the emperor for delivering justice. The demonstrations of faith through self-mortification that occur during festivals push the boundaries of human endurance. Pilgrims engage in acts of penance that range from simple fasting to extreme physical punishment. Some pilgrims walk the entire distance to holy sites on their knees, the skin wearing away and their kneecaps grinding against bone. Others carry heavy crosses or chains, the weight causing their bodies to break down over the journey. The most extreme penitents engage in crucifixion, having themselves nailed to crosses and left hanging for days as demonstrations of their devotion. The ecclesiarchy encourages these practices, teaching that physical suffering brings spiritual enlightenment and demonstrates true faith. The festival crowds create dangerous conditions through sheer density of human bodies. Millions of people packed into spaces designed for far fewer results in regular stampedes that kill thousands. The crowds press so tightly that people cannot fall when they lose consciousness, held upright by the bodies around them until they suffocate. Children are crushed underfoot. The elderly are trampled. The festival organizers make no provisions for crowd safety because the deaths are viewed as acceptable losses, martyrs who died while engaged in holy observance. The bodies are collected after festivals end and processed for corpse starch like any other dead, their flesh becoming rations for the survivors. The psychological impact of constant religious observance shapes imperial citizens from birth to death. The endless prayers, the mandatory attendance at services, the fear of being accused of heresy, all combine to create populations that are simultaneously devout and terrified. Workers internalize the ecclesiarchy's teachings, genuinely believing in the emperor's divinity and their own worthlessness except as servants to his will. This belief system provides some comfort in lives otherwise devoid of hope, offering the promise of reward after death for those who remain faithful. The promise of sitting at the emperor's side in the afterlife gives meaning to suffering that would otherwise be unbearable. The ecclesiarchy's dominance extends into every aspect of life, making separation of religious and secular impossible in imperial society. A worker cannot simply do their job, they must do it as an act of worship. They cannot simply eat, they must thank the emperor for their sustenance. They cannot simply sleep, they must pray for protection during their rest. Every moment becomes an opportunity for devotion or a potential failure of faith. The constant pressure to demonstrate sufficient piety creates populations that are exhausted not just physically, but spiritually, their minds as worn down as their bodies by the demands placed upon them. The Adeptus Arbites are not police in any sense that would be recognizable to civilized societies. They are enforcers of imperial law, judge and executioner combined into armored figures whose presence means someone is about to die or wish they had. An Arbites patrol moving through a hive city district causes crowds to scatter, workers pressing themselves against walls or ducking into doorways to avoid notice. The Arbites wear carapace armor painted in black and red, their faces hidden behind helmets equipped with vox grills that distort their voices into mechanical growls. They carry shotguns, shock mauls, and bolt pistols, weapons designed to kill or incapacitate with brutal efficiency. Their fortresses exist in every major imperial city, massive structures built like military installations, because that is exactly what they are. The Arbites operate under the Lex Imperialis, the body of imperial law that supposedly governs all human worlds. In practice, the Lex Imperialis consists of core strictures that apply universally and vast amounts of local variation that changes from world to world, sometimes from city to city. The core laws are simple and absolute. Mutation is punishable by death. Unsanctioned psychic ability is punishable by death. Heresy is punishable by death. Refusing to pay tithes is punishable by death. Interfering with imperial officials is punishable by death. The list continues, but the pattern is clear. The Imperium solves most legal problems through execution. The local variations in imperial law create situations where an action that is perfectly legal on one world becomes a capital offense on another. On Necromunda, carrying a weapon is not merely legal but expected, with most citizens armed as a matter of survival. On nearby Armageddon, unauthorized weapon possession results in immediate arrest and likely execution. A citizen traveling between these worlds, assuming they somehow obtain the necessary documentation, could find themselves executed for behavior that was mandatory on their home planet. The Arbites do not care about these discrepancies. Their job is enforcing the law as it exists in their jurisdiction, and ignorance provides no defense. The Arbites maintain their own court system, separate from any planetary government or local authority. An Arbites courthouse is a fortress within a fortress, a section of their precinct fortress dedicated to processing the accused through trials that are perfunctory at best. The trials follow established formats that have remained unchanged for millennia. The accused is brought before an Arbites judge, a senior officer who has demonstrated sufficient ruthlessness and adherence to protocol to earn the position. The charges are read. The evidence is presented, usually consisting of testimony from the arresting officers and whatever physical evidence they collected. The accused may speak in their own defense, though this rarely matters. Defense attorneys do not exist in the Arbites court system. The concept of legal representation for the accused is viewed as weakness, a corruption that would undermine the swift administration of justice. The accused stands alone before the judge, expected to defend themselves against charges they often do not fully understand. A worker arrested for suspected heresy might not even know what specific action or statement led to their arrest. The arbites do not explain. They accuse, and the accused must somehow prove their innocence without any knowledge of law, without any ability to compel witnesses, without any resources beyond their own words. The trials last minutes rather than hours. A judge hears perhaps 50 cases per day, spending an average of 10 to 15 minutes on each. The judge asks a few questions, reviews the evidence, and renders a verdict. Guilty verdicts outnumber innocent verdicts by ratios that approach 100 to 1. The arbites operate on the principle that they do not arrest innocent people, so anyone brought before a judge must have done something wrong. A verdict of innocence implies that the arresting officers made an error, and such implications are not made lightly. Judges who acquit too many defendants face investigation themselves, accused of corruption or insufficient zeal in enforcing the law. The sentences handed down by arbites judges vary based on the severity of the crime and the judge's assessment of the criminal's potential usefulness. Minor infractions, things like petty theft or minor violence that did not target imperial property or personnel, might result in flogging or short-term imprisonment. More serious crimes result in longer sentences or conversion to servitors. The most serious crimes, anything involving heresy, mutation, or interference with imperial operations, result in immediate execution. The executions are carried out within hours of sentencing, usually in the courthouse itself, with the bodies disposed of through standard corpse starch processing. Summary execution represents the arbites' preferred method of dealing with criminals caught in the act. An arbites patrol that encounters someone committing a crime does not always bother with arrest. If the crime is serious enough and the evidence is clear, the senior officer simply executes the criminal on the spot with a bolt round to the head. This practice is not merely legal but encouraged, viewed as efficient administration of justice that saves the time and resources required for a trial. The arbites file a report documenting the execution, and the body is collected by sanitation servitors. The entire process from crime to corpse takes minutes. The arbites' authority to execute extends to crimes that would be considered minor in any reasonable legal system. A worker who shoves an arbites officer while trying to escape a crowd crush might be executed for assaulting an imperial official. A citizen who fails to immediately obey an arbites order, perhaps because they did not hear it over the noise of a manufactorum, might be shot for refusing to comply with lawful instructions. The arbites do not issue warnings. They give orders once, and failure to comply immediately results in violence. This policy creates an atmosphere of terror around arbites patrols, with citizens desperately trying to anticipate what the arbites want and comply before orders are even given. Servitor conversion serves as both punishment and resource recovery, the Imperium's solution to the problem of what to do with criminals who are not worth executing, but cannot be allowed to remain in society. The process begins with the convicted criminal being transferred from arbites custody to a conversion facility, usually operated by the Adeptus Mechanicus or licensed tech priests. The facilities are industrial spaces filled with surgical equipment, augmetic components, and the screams of those undergoing conversion. The criminal is strapped to a surgical table, and the process begins. The lobotomization that forms the core of servitor conversion involves removing large portions of the brain's frontal lobe and other areas responsible for higher cognitive function, personality, and independent thought. The surgeons leave only enough neural tissue to process basic instructions and control motor functions. The exact amount removed depends on the servitor's intended purpose. A servitor designed for simple labor needs very little brain function, just enough to understand commands like lift, carry, and put down. A servitor intended for more complex technical work requires more cognitive capability, though still far less than a fully functional human. The surgery is crude and conducted without anesthesia because the mechanicus views pain as irrelevant to the procedure's success. Following lobotomization, the subject receives augmetic enhancements appropriate to their future role. A labor servitor gets enhanced musculature, reinforced skeletal structure, and industrial tools grafted directly to their arms. A combat servitor receives weapon mounts, targeting systems, and armor plating. A technical servitor gets specialized tools, enhanced sensory equipment, and data ports that allow direct interface with machinery. The augmentation process involves cutting away organic components and replacing them with mechanical parts, the subject's body becoming a hybrid of flesh and metal. The organic parts that remain require minimal maintenance, just enough nutrition to keep the biological components functioning. The completed servitor retains no memory of its previous existence and no personality beyond the programmed responses installed during conversion. It follows orders with mechanical precision, incapable of questioning instructions or refusing commands. The servitor works until its organic components fail from age or damage, at which point it is recycled and its augmetic parts are recovered for use in new servitors. The Imperium produces millions of servitors annually, and a substantial percentage come from the Arbites court system, criminals converted into useful tools through the miracle of lobotomization and augmentation. Penal legions represent another common sentence for convicted criminals, particularly those convicted of crimes that demonstrated physical capability or combat potential. The Imperial Guard maintains penal legions composed entirely of criminals, political prisoners, and others deemed expendable but potentially useful. Assignment to a penal legion is technically a sentence with a defined term, usually 10 to 20 years, but in practice it is a death sentence with extra steps. The penal legions receive the most dangerous assignments, the suicide missions that regular guard regiments refuse. They are sent to clear minefields by walking through them, to assault fortified positions without support, to hold ground against impossible odds while more valuable troops withdraw. The conditions in penal legions make regular Imperial Guard service look comfortable. The convicts wear explosive collars that detonate if they retreat without orders or attempt to desert. They receive minimal equipment, often just a lasgun and a few charge packs, and are expected to scavenge anything else they need from the battlefield. Their officers are regular guard personnel assigned to penal legion duty as punishment for their own failures or infractions, and these officers treat the convicts with open contempt. The penal legionaries are told that faithful service can earn redemption, that surviving their sentence will restore their status as imperial citizens, but the survival rate is so low that this promise is effectively meaningless. Labor camps exist on nearly every imperial world, facilities where convicted criminals serve sentences of hard labor in conditions that kill most inmates within years. The camps are located in the most inhospitable areas available, places where the environment itself serves as part of the punishment. On ice worlds, labor camps operate in regions where temperatures drop low enough to freeze exposed flesh in minutes. On desert worlds, camps are built in areas where daytime temperatures exceed what unprotected humans can survive. On toxic worlds, camps occupy zones where the very air is poisonous. The inmates work in these conditions with minimal protection, their labor extracting resources or performing tasks too dangerous or unpleasant for regular workers. A typical labor camp on a mining world might house 10,000 inmates in barracks that barely keep out the elements. The inmates work 12 to 16-hour shifts in the mines, using primitive equipment to extract ore from deep underground. The mines are unstable, prone to collapse, filled with toxic gases, and subject to flooding from underground water sources. Inmates die regularly from cave-ins, gas exposure, equipment failures, and simple exhaustion. The camp authorities replace the dead with new convicts, maintaining the labor force at required levels through constant replenishment. The inmates receive minimal rations, just enough to keep them capable of work, and no medical care beyond basic first aid for injuries that would prevent them from working. The discipline in labor camps is maintained through violence and the threat of worse punishment. Guards patrol with shock mauls and whips, beating inmates who work too slowly or show any sign of resistance. Inmates who attempt escape are hunted down and executed publicly, their bodies left displayed as warnings to others. Those who commit infractions within the camp face punishment cells, small boxes barely large enough to crouch in, where inmates are locked for days or weeks with no food and minimal water. The punishment cells are often placed in the worst environmental conditions available, exposed to extreme heat or cold, ensuring that time in the cells causes permanent physical damage even if the inmate survives. Public flogging remains a common punishment for minor infractions across the Imperium, a spectacle designed to humiliate the convicted while providing entertainment and instruction for the masses. The floggings occur in public squares or outside Arbites fortresses, with the convicted stripped and bound to flogging posts. The flogger, usually an Arbites officer or trained servitor, uses a whip designed to cause maximum pain and visible damage without killing the subject. The number of lashes varies based on the crime, ranging from 10 for minor infractions to hundreds for more serious offenses. A flogging of more than 50 lashes typically causes permanent scarring and often results in the subject's death from shock or infection. The crowds that gather for public floggings are encouraged by the Arbites, who view the spectacle as an educational opportunity. The charges against the convicted are read aloud before the flogging begins, explaining to the crowd exactly what behavior led to this punishment. The flogging itself is conducted methodically, with pauses between lashes to allow the crowd to observe the damage and the convicted to fully experience the pain. The Arbites sometimes force family members of the convicted to watch, ensuring they understand the consequences of criminal behavior. Children are brought to floggings as part of their education, learning early what awaits those who break imperial law. Lobotomization, as a punishment distinct from servitor conversion, is used for criminals whose crimes do not warrant death, but who are deemed too dangerous to remain in society, even in a reduced capacity. These individuals undergo brain surgery that removes their ability to commit violence or think independently while leaving them capable of basic labor. Unlike servitors, they are not augmented with mechanical components, but simply return to society as mentally diminished workers. They can perform simple repetitive tasks under supervision, but lack the cognitive ability to plan crimes or resist authority. These lobotomized workers are marked with brands or tattoos identifying their status, and they are typically assigned to the most unpleasant work available as a continued form of punishment. The concept of appeals does not exist in the Arbites court system. A verdict, once rendered, is final and immediately enforceable. There is no higher court to which the convicted can petition, no process for reviewing evidence or challenging the judge's decision. The Arbites view appeals as weakness, a system that would undermine the certainty and swiftness of imperial justice. A criminal sentenced to death is executed within hours. A criminal sentenced to servitor conversion is transferred to conversion facilities immediately. A criminal sentenced to a labor camp is shipped out on the next available transport. The speed of imperial justice ensures that by the time anyone might think to question a verdict, the sentence has already been carried out. Guilt by association extends imperial justice beyond the individual criminal to their entire social network. The Arbites operate on the principle that criminals do not exist in isolation, that family members and close associates must have known about the criminal activity and failed to report it. When someone is convicted of a serious crime, particularly heresy or sedition, the Arbites investigate their entire family and social circle. Family members are arrested and interrogated, their homes searched, their activities scrutinized. Those who cannot prove they had no knowledge of the criminal's activities face charges themselves, often receiving sentences nearly as severe as the original criminal. Collective punishment extends this principle to entire hab blocks or districts when authorities determine that a community harbored criminals or failed to report suspicious activity. The Arbites might seal off an entire hab block, preventing anyone from entering or leaving while they conduct investigations. During these lockdowns, which can last weeks or months, the residents receive reduced rations and no access to medical care or other services. The Arbites search every unit, interrogate every resident, and arrest anyone who cannot satisfactorily explain their activities or associations. These operations often result in hundreds of arrests from a single hab block, with entire families processed for servitor conversion or shipped to labor camps. The preventive detention that the Arbites practice allows them to arrest individuals who have not yet committed crimes but are deemed likely to do so. A citizen with a history of minor infractions might be arrested and detained indefinitely on the theory that they will eventually commit a serious crime. A citizen who associates with known criminals, even if they have committed no crime themselves, can be arrested for preventive purposes. The detention facilities for these individuals are indistinguishable from prisons for convicted criminals, and the conditions are equally brutal. Detainees have no right to trial or release, existing in legal limbo until the Arbites decide they are no longer a threat or until they die in custody. The Arbites maintain extensive surveillance networks that monitor Imperial citizens constantly. On Hive worlds, picked recorders are mounted at every intersection, in every public space, and in many areas that citizens consider private. The feeds from these recorders are monitored by servitors and junior Arbites officers, watching for criminal activity or suspicious behavior. The definition of suspicious behavior is broad enough to encompass almost anything. A citizen who takes an unusual route to work might be flagged for investigation. A citizen who meets with the same group of people regularly might be suspected of conspiracy. The surveillance creates an atmosphere where citizens assume they are always being watched and modify their behavior accordingly. The informant networks that supplement technological surveillance are even more pervasive. The Arbites recruit informants from every level of society, offering rewards for information about criminal activity. The rewards vary from small payments to reduced sentences for the informant's own crimes. Some informants work for the Arbites voluntarily, motivated by genuine loyalty to the Imperium or personal grudges against their targets. Others are coerced into cooperation through threats or blackmail. The informant networks create situations where no one can be trusted, where a casual conversation might be reported to the Arbites, where expressing any doubt or complaint could lead to arrest. The torture chambers in Arbites fortresses serve multiple purposes, extracting confessions from the accused and information from those suspected of knowing about criminal activity. The Arbites employ trained interrogators who use a variety of techniques to break subjects, ranging from simple beatings to sophisticated methods involving drugs, psychic interrogation, and mechanical devices designed to cause maximum pain. The interrogators are not seeking truth, but rather confessions, and they continue their work until the subject confesses to whatever crimes the Arbites suspect. Innocent subjects confess regularly, unable to endure the torture, and these false confessions are treated as valid evidence in subsequent trials. The execution methods employed by the Arbites vary based on the nature of the crime and local tradition. Shooting remains the most common method, quick and efficient, usually accomplished with a bolt pistol round to the head. Hanging is used for crimes involving theft or economic offenses. Burning is reserved for heretics, the flames symbolically purifying their corruption. More elaborate executions are used for particularly heinous crimes, or when the Arbites want to make an example. Criminals might be crucified and left to die slowly over days. They might be drawn and quartered, their bodies torn apart by vehicles or servitors. They might be fed to local predators in public arenas while crowds watch. The cruelty of the execution reflects the severity of the crime and serves as a warning to others. The bodies of executed criminals are processed like any other corpses, rendered down for corpse starch or converted into servitors if enough intact tissue remains. The Arbites maintain detailed records of all executions, documenting the criminal's identity, their crime, the sentence, and the method of execution. These records are filed in vast archives within Arbites fortresses, millions of documents recording millions of deaths. The archives serve no practical purpose beyond bureaucratic completeness, but the Arbites maintain them with the same dedication they bring to all their duties, ensuring that every death is properly documented even if no one will ever review the records. The Escher gangs of Necromunda's Underhive control vast territories through a combination of chemical expertise and ruthless violence. They're all-female membership drawn from generations of women who have known nothing but gang life. These gangs operate sophisticated chem labs in hidden locations throughout the Underhive, producing stims, combat drugs, and toxins that they sell to other gangs or use themselves. An Escher ganger typically stands lean and wiry, her body enhanced by the chemicals she consumes daily, her reflexes artificially quickened to inhuman levels. The gangs marked their territory with distinctive tags sprayed in bioluminescent paint, warnings to rivals that crossing into Escher ground means death. Their weapons are often coated with custom toxins that cause agonizing deaths, and they favor needle rifles and stiletto knives that deliver these poisons efficiently. The Goliath gangs occupy different territories, usually areas closer to the Underhive's geothermal vents and industrial waste zones where the heat and pollution suit their augmented physiques. Goliath gangers are massive figures, their bodies swollen with muscle from growth stims and crude augmetics that enhance their strength to superhuman levels. A typical Goliath stands over 2 meters tall and weighs perhaps 200 kilograms of enhanced muscle and bone. They favor heavy weapons that other gangers cannot even lift, stub cannons and heavy bolters scavenged from Imperial Guard supplies or stolen from manufactorums. Their territories are marked by crude totems built from scrap metal and the skulls of defeated enemies, structures that serve as both warnings and displays of the gang's power. The Orlok gangs control the most valuable Underhive territories, the areas with access to mineral deposits or salvageable archaeotech that can be sold to traders from the Upper Hive. These gangs operate more like businesses than simple criminal organizations, maintaining mining operations and salvage crews that extract resources for sale. An Orlok ganger dresses in practical work clothes reinforced with scavenged armor plates, carrying reliable weapons like autoguns and shotguns rather than the exotic equipment favored by other houses. They maintain discipline through a hierarchy based on earning and contribution rather than simple violence, though they are no less capable of brutality when their territories are threatened. The Orloks pay protection money to corrupt enforcers in the lower hive, buying themselves a degree of legitimacy that other gangs lack. The Van Saar gangs possess technological capabilities that exceed even some upper hive organizations, their members maintaining ancient plasma weapons and energy shields passed down through generations. The gang's technical expertise comes at a cost, as the archaeotech they guard leaks radiation that slowly kills them, leaving Van Saar gangers with a distinctive appearance of premature aging and radiation sickness. Their territories are located in areas containing the most valuable archaeotech, ancient structures from the dark age of technology that still function after millennia. The Van Saar guard these locations jealously, knowing that their technological advantage is the only thing keeping them competitive with larger and more numerous gangs. They sell their services as tech specialists to other gangs, repairing weapons and equipment in exchange for resources or territory. The Dalak gangs operate through information rather than direct force, their members serving as spies, assassins, and information brokers throughout the Underhive. A Dalak ganger is difficult to identify, as the gang encourages its members to blend into the general population, appearing as ordinary workers or Underhive dwellers while gathering intelligence. They maintain extensive networks of informants and use blackmail and assassination to control territories without obvious displays of force. The Dalak possess connections that extend into the Upper Hive and even to off-world organizations, trading information for resources and protection. Their headquarters are hidden in the deepest parts of the Underhive, locations known only to full gang members and protected by traps and hidden sentries. The Khador gangs bring religious fanaticism to Underhive gang warfare, their members viewing themselves as the Emperor's chosen instruments for purging the Underhive of heresy and corruption. Khador gangers dress in tattered robes marked with crude aquillas and carry weapons decorated with religious iconography, fighting with the fervor of true believers. They control territories through a combination of violence and religious conversion, forcing conquered populations to adopt their extreme interpretation of the Imperial Creed. The Khador maintain massive bonfire shrines where they burn heretics and mutants, the flames visible throughout their territories and serving as constant reminders of their presence. They are among the poorest of the major gangs, relying on scavenged equipment and numerical superiority rather than sophisticated weapons. The territories controlled by these gangs function as independent fiefdoms within the Underhive, areas where imperial law does not reach, and gang law provides the only order. A typical gang territory might encompass several square kilometers of Underhive ruins, housing thousands of people who pay protection money to the gang in exchange for relative safety. The gangs provide services that the Imperium does not, settling disputes between residents, protecting against raids from rival gangs, and maintaining some semblance of order in the chaos of the Underhive. Residents who refuse to pay protection money or who violate gang rules face swift punishment, usually beatings or expulsion from the territory, though serious violations result in execution. The gang wars that erupt regularly between these organizations kill thousands and reshape territorial boundaries constantly. A war might begin over a disputed salvage claim, a perceived insult between gang leaders, or simple opportunism when one gang appears weak. The fighting is brutal and often involves civilians caught in the crossfire, with entire settlements destroyed when gangs deploy heavy weapons in populated areas. The Adeptus Arbites occasionally intervene in gang wars when the violence threatens to spread to the lower hive or disrupts tithe collections, sending heavily armed patrols into the Underhive to suppress both sides. These interventions are temporary, as the Arbites lack the resources to maintain permanent control over the Underhive, and gang activity resumes once they withdraw. Corruption among imperial officials operates at every level of the administratum and extends into virtually every branch of imperial government. In administratum scribe processing work, permits might demand bribes of several days' wages to move a petition from the bottom of a processing queue to the top, turning a months-long wait into a matter of weeks. The scribe operates openly, making expectations clear through careful phrasing and meaningful pauses during interactions with petitioners. A scribe might mention that they are experiencing unusual processing delays, then wait for the petitioner to offer compensation. The petitioner who understands the system offers payment discreetly, sliding currency or valuable items across the desk during the conversation. The petitioner who refuses or fails to understand finds their petition lost in the bureaucratic machinery, possibly forever. The protection rackets run by corrupt enforcers represent a more aggressive form of official corruption, with Adeptus Arbites officers and local security forces extorting businesses and individuals for regular payments. An enforcer patrol might visit a merchant's shop weekly, making it clear that continued operation depends on paying for protection. The protection is ostensibly against criminal activity, but the implicit threat is that without payment, the enforcers themselves will find violations of imperial law that justify shutting down the business or arresting the owner. The merchants pay because refusing means losing everything, and the enforcers collect because their official wages are insufficient to maintain the lifestyle they desire. The black markets controlled by merchant guilds and criminal syndicates operate with the tacit approval of corrupt officials who receive percentages of the profits. On Necromunda, the black market in real food, weapons, and off-world luxuries generates enormous wealth for the organizations that control it, and these organizations maintain their positions through payments to enforcers, administratum officials, and even some Arbites officers. A black market operation might occupy an entire section of the Underhive, with warehouses full of contraband goods and hundreds of workers processing and distributing merchandise. The operation continues because the officials who should be shutting it down are instead protecting it, warning the operators about upcoming raids and ensuring that investigations find nothing incriminating. The press gangs that roam imperial cities collecting bodies for the Imperial Navy and Astra Militarum operate with legal authority but function like criminal organizations. These gangs consist of Navy personnel or guard recruiters accompanied by enforcers, authorized to seize citizens and impress them into military service. The press gangs target areas where resistance will be minimal, sweeping through lower hive districts or agri-world settlements and grabbing anyone who meets basic physical requirements. A young worker walking home from a shift might be grabbed by press gangers, thrown into a transport vehicle, and shipped off-world before their family even knows they are missing. The press gangs operate on quotas, needing to collect specific numbers of recruits within designated timeframes, and they are not particular about who they take as long as the bodies meet minimum standards. The Navy press gangs specifically target void stations and port cities, locations where they can quickly transfer pressed crew to waiting ships. A press gang operation might seal off an entire district, preventing anyone from leaving, while gangers move through checking documentation and physical condition. Those selected are immediately transferred to holding facilities where they undergo basic processing before being assigned to ships. The Navy needs constant replacements for crew lost to accidents, combat, and the simple attrition of void service, and pressed crew fill these positions. The pressed sailors receive no training beyond what they learn on the job, thrown into positions operating equipment they do not understand, while officers threaten them with execution for mistakes. The organ leggers who operate in underhive territories and lower hive districts harvest augmetics and organic parts from living victims, supplying black market Medicaid facilities and corrupt tech priests. These criminals target the vulnerable, grabbing underhive dwellers who will not be missed, or lower hive workers who lack the connections to prompt investigations into their disappearances. The organ leggers operate from hidden facilities where they perform crude surgery, removing augmetic limbs, organs, and even eyes from their victims. The victims are usually killed during the process or left to die afterward, their bodies dumped in waste reclamation areas or simply left where they fall. The harvested parts are sold to facilities that ask no questions about their origins, installed in patients who either do not care or do not know that their new augmetics were taken from murdered victims. The trade in augmetics is particularly profitable because replacement parts are expensive and difficult to obtain through legitimate channels. A worker who loses an arm in an industrial accident faces years of waiting for an official augmetic replacement, during which time they cannot work and therefore cannot earn rations. The black market offers immediate solutions, augmetics available within days for prices that are high but manageable compared to the alternative of starving while waiting for official channels. The workers who purchase these black market augmetics often discover too late that the parts are poorly maintained or incompatible with their bodies, leading to infections, rejections, or simple mechanical failures. The organ leggers care nothing for these consequences, having already collected their payment and moved on to the next victim. The slavers who provide merchandise to various imperial institutions operate openly in some regions and covertly in others, depending on local laws and the strength of enforcement. On frontier worlds and in the underhives of major planets, slavers capture people and sell them to labor camps, penal colonies, or private individuals who need workers and do not want to deal with official labor allocation systems. The slavers use various methods, from outright kidnapping to debt bondage schemes that trap people in permanent servitude. A citizen who borrows money at usurious rates might find themselves unable to repay the debt, at which point the lender claims them as property to work off the balance. The work-off period is calculated to ensure the debtor can never actually clear their obligation, creating permanent slaves in all but name. The markets where slaves are bought and sold exist in locations where authorities choose not to look, warehouse districts or underhive territories where transactions occur quickly and participants disperse before anyone can intervene. A slave market might operate for a few hours, buyers examining merchandise and making purchases, then disappear completely as participants scatter to avoid detection. The slaves themselves are kept in holding facilities between markets, locked in cages or chained in warehouses, fed minimal rations, and provided no medical care. Many die before being sold, their bodies disposed of like any other waste. Those who are sold face uncertain fates, possibly ending up in labor camps where they might survive, or in private hands where their treatment depends entirely on their owner's disposition. The constant surveillance that imperial citizens endure creates an atmosphere of paranoia that affects every aspect of life. The servo skulls that float through hab blocks and manufactorums record conversations constantly, their picked recorders and audio pickups capturing everything within range. Citizens learn to watch what they say, avoiding any statements that could be interpreted as heretical or seditious. A worker complaining about working conditions might find themselves arrested after a servo skull records their complaints and flags them for investigation. A citizen expressing doubt about the emperor's divinity, even in a moment of despair or exhaustion, creates a record that can be used against them later. The informant networks that supplement technological surveillance are even more insidious because they turn everyone into potential threats. A citizen never knows which of their neighbors, coworkers, or even family members might be reporting to the authorities. The Adeptus Arbites and Inquisition maintain vast networks of informants, recruiting people through various means including payment, threats, or appeals to loyalty. Some informants work voluntarily, genuinely believing they are serving the emperor by reporting suspicious activity. Others are coerced, threatened with punishment for their own infractions unless they provide information about others. The informant networks create situations where trust becomes impossible, where every conversation must be carefully measured, where expressing any genuine thought or feeling risks betrayal. The fear that anyone could be an agent of the Inquisition permeates imperial society at every level. The Inquisition operates through networks of agents and informants who appear to be ordinary citizens, their true allegiances hidden until they choose to reveal them. An inquisitorial agent might work in a manufactorum for years, appearing to be a normal worker while actually gathering information about heretical activity or corruption. The agent might be a senior administrator, a junior clerk, a menial laborer, or anyone else, their position chosen to provide access to the information the Inquisition seeks. Citizens who discover they have been working alongside an inquisitorial agent for years experience profound paranoia, realizing that every conversation was potentially monitored, every action potentially reported. The Inquisition's agents use their cover positions to identify threats to the Imperium, investigating suspected heresy, mutation, or corruption. An agent might spend months or years building relationships with suspects, gaining their trust and learning about their activities before finally moving against them. The investigations often result in mass arrests, with the agent's testimony serving as primary evidence in subsequent trials. The suspects rarely have any idea they were under investigation until Arbites officers arrive to arrest them, having been completely deceived by the agent's cover identity. The effectiveness of these operations depends on the paranoia they create, the knowledge that anyone might be an inquisitorial agent making citizens police their own behavior and report suspicious activity in hopes of avoiding suspicion themselves. The combination of gang violence, official corruption, social predation, and constant surveillance creates an environment where imperial citizens exist in a state of perpetual anxiety. They must navigate gang territories while avoiding getting caught in gang wars. They must pay bribes to corrupt officials while having barely enough resources to survive. They must avoid press gangs, organ leggers, and slavers while going about their daily lives. They must watch every word they say and every action they take, knowing that surveillance systems and informants monitor constantly. The psychological toll of this existence is immense, breaking down mental health and creating populations that are traumatized, paranoid, and utterly broken by the systems that govern them. The first sign of an Orkwa approaching an imperial world is usually the disruption of astropathic communication, the psychic scream of millions of greenskins drowning out the carefully maintained choir of imperial telepaths. On agri-world Griffon 4, the planetary governor received garbled warnings about a massive Ork fleet 3 weeks before the first ships entered the system. Those 3 weeks provided no meaningful preparation time, because the Imperium's response mechanisms move at speeds measured in months or years, not weeks. The governor sent desperate requests for military assistance through every available channel, but the nearest Imperial Guard regiments were engaged in campaign sectors away, and the Imperial Navy maintained only a token presence in the system. By the time the Orks made planetfall, Griffon 4 stood essentially alone, its defense consisting of a single undermanned PDF regiment and whatever civilian militia could be hastily assembled. The Ork landing craft descended through the atmosphere in a chaotic swarm, their hulls covered in crude glyphs and trailing smoke from engines that should not function, but did through sheer Ork belief in their own technology. The craft crashed into agricultural zones with no attempt at precision landing, the Orks simply pointing their ships downward and letting momentum do the rest. Each crashed ship disgorged hundreds of Orks, massive green-skinned creatures standing 2 to 3 meters tall, their bodies slabs of muscle and scar tissue. The orcs immediately began looting everything in sight, stripping crashed ships for scrap metal, tearing apart farming equipment to build weapons, and killing any humans they encountered with casual brutality. An orc does not operate according to human military logic. The greenskins fight because fighting is what they exist to do, and they will continue fighting until they are all dead or everything around them is destroyed. The PDF forces that attempted to contain the initial orc landings discovered quickly that their training and equipment were inadequate for the task. A PDF trooper on Griffon 4 carried a lasgun, wore flak armor, and had perhaps 6 months of basic training. The orcs they faced were veterans of dozens of campaigns, their bodies naturally resistant to damage that would kill humans instantly, armed with weapons that ranged from crude slug throwers to captured Imperial equipment. A PDF squad might fire an entire volley into an orc, watching their bolts burn through green flesh, only to have the orc keep charging and tear them apart with a rusted chainsword or simply its bare hands. The PDF casualties in the first week of fighting exceeded 50%, with entire companies wiped out in battles that lasted minutes. The civilian population of Griffon 4 learned about the invasion through a combination of official announcements and the simple reality of orcs appearing in their settlements. The planetary government issued evacuation orders for regions near the landing sites, but evacuation requires transportation, destinations, and organization that did not exist. The agri-settlements that dotted Griffon 4's surface were connected by dirt roads suitable for farming vehicles, not mass evacuations. A settlement that received evacuation orders might have a few trucks and tractors, enough to move perhaps 10% of the population. The rest were told to walk to designated safe zones that were hundreds of kilometers away, carrying whatever supplies they could manage. The elderly, the very young, and the disabled could not make such journeys and were effectively abandoned. The orcs reached the first major settlements within days of landing, their mobs advancing in loose formations that somehow maintained coordination despite appearing completely chaotic. An orc mob might consist of hundreds of greenskins, some riding in ramshackle vehicles cobbled together from scrap, others simply running on foot while firing weapons wildly. The mobs hit settlements like natural disasters, overwhelming any resistance through sheer numbers and ferocity. The settlers who attempted to defend their homes with hunting rifles and farming implements died quickly. Those who tried to flee often died slower, run down by orc vehicles, or caught by the faster greenskins who treated the hunt as sport. The orcs did not take prisoners in any conventional sense, but they did capture humans for various purposes. Some captives were forced to work as slaves, building fortifications or hauling scrap under orc supervision that consisted primarily of beatings and threats. The slaves received no food or water beyond what they could scavenge, and the orcs killed them casually when they became too weak to work. Other captives served as entertainment, forced to fight each other or pitted against orc squigs, vicious creatures that the greenskins bred for various purposes. The fights were not fair contests, but spectacles where the outcome was predetermined and the human's death was the entertainment. Some captives simply disappeared into orc camps, their fates unknown, but certainly terrible given what was known about orc behavior. The planetary government's response to the invasion demonstrated the Imperium's standard approach to civilian protection during wartime, which is to say there was no protection. The governor and his senior officials evacuated to the planetary capital's fortified government complex within days of the first landings, taking with them their families, key administrators, and enough supplies to survive an extended siege. The capital itself became a fortress, with PDF forces pulled back from forward positions to defend the city's walls, while the surrounding countryside was effectively abandoned. The government issued statements about strategic withdrawal and consolidation of forces, but the reality was simpler. The elite were saving themselves while leaving everyone else to die. The evacuation ships that arrived at Griffon 4's orbital station in the weeks following the invasion had capacity for perhaps 50,000 passengers total, a fraction of the planet's population of 8 million. The ships were commandeered merchant vessels and system defense boats, pressed into service to evacuate whoever could reach the orbital station. Access to the evacuation ships was controlled by armed guards who checked documentation and authorization, ensuring that only those with proper clearance could board. The proper clearance belonged to government officials, wealthy merchants, guild masters, and their families. The ordinary citizens who somehow reached the orbital station, having survived Orc attacks and the journey through a war zone, found themselves turned away at gunpoint while ships departed half-empty. The riots that erupted at the orbital station when citizens realized they would not be evacuated were suppressed with lethal force. The station's security forces, reinforced by PDF troopers assigned to protect the evacuation, opened fire on crowds trying to force their way onto ships. The fighting in the station's docking bays killed hundreds, their bodies left floating in the zero gravity while the evacuation continued around them. Some desperate citizens attempted to stow away on departing ships, hiding in cargo holds or maintenance spaces. Most were discovered and ejected into space. A few succeeded in escaping, though their survival depended on not being discovered until the ship reached its destination, where they would likely be arrested for unauthorized travel. The Imperial Guard forces that eventually arrived at Griffon 4, 6 weeks after the initial Orc landings, found a planet already largely overrun. The Guard regiments deployed directly into combat zones, their drop ships descending through Orc anti-aircraft fire that filled the sky with tracer rounds and crude missiles. The Guard's arrival did not herald salvation for the civilian population, but rather the beginning of a different kind of nightmare. The Guard's mission was to destroy the Orc threat, not to protect civilians, and their tactics reflected this priority. Artillery bombardments flattened settlements that Orcs were using as staging areas, killing any civilians still present along with the greenskins. Armored advances crushed everything in their path, Guard tanks rolling through refugee columns without slowing because the mission timeline did not allow for delays. The conscription that accompanied the Guard's arrival swept up every able-bodied civilian the Imperial forces encountered. The Guard needed replacements for casualties they knew they would take in the coming battles, and the civilian population represented readily available manpower. The conscription teams operated with brutal efficiency, separating civilians into groups based on age and physical condition. Those deemed suitable for military service were immediately inducted into the Guard, given lasguns and perhaps an hour of instruction on how to fire them, then sent into combat. The new conscripts had no training in tactics, no understanding of military discipline, and no time to process what was happening to them. They were simply additional bodies to throw at the Orcs, and the Guard commanders expected most of them to die in their first engagement. The conscripts taken from Griffon 4's civilian population found themselves in situations that exceeded their worst nightmares. A farmer who had never fired a weapon in his life might find himself in a trench facing an Orc charge, surrounded by strangers who were equally terrified and confused. The Guard sergeants and officers who commanded these conscript units showed no patience for their inexperience, enforcing discipline through immediate execution of anyone who hesitated or attempted to flee. The conscripts learned quickly that they had two choices: advance toward the Orcs and probably die, or retreat and definitely die at the hands of their own officers. Most chose to advance, driven by the slim hope that they might somehow survive. The Tyranid hive fleet that approached agri-world Prandium generated different warning signs, the psychic scream of the hive mind causing sanctioned psychers across the sector to collapse in seizures or go mad. The warnings that reached Prandium's government were more specific than those that preceded the Orc invasion of Griffon 4, as the Imperium had developed protocols for responding to Tyranid threats through painful experience. The protocols called for immediate evacuation of all non-essential personnel and the implementation of scorched earth policies to deny the Tyranids biomass. In practice, this meant the government began evacuating itself while ordering the civilian population to destroy their own food supplies and infrastructure. The vanguard organisms that preceded the main Tyranid fleet reached Prandium weeks before the hive ships entered the system, small creatures called lictors and genestealers that infiltrated population centers and began preparing for the main assault. The lictors were perfect ambush predators, creatures standing over 2 meters tall with chameleonic skin that made them nearly invisible. They killed silently, targeting isolated individuals in small groups, their deaths attributed to accidents or random violence until the pattern became undeniable. The genestealers operated differently, infiltrating communities and implanting genetic material in victims who then became hosts for hybrid offspring. The genestealer cults that formed in Prandium cities operated as fifth columns, sabotaging defenses and spreading confusion as the main fleet approached. The appearance of the Tyranid fleet in Prandium's orbit presented a sight that broke minds. The hive ships were biological constructs the size of cities, living vessels covered in chitinous armor and bristling with weapon organisms that fired projectiles of crystallized toxins and bioplasma. The fleet numbered in the hundreds, each ship carrying millions of Tyranid organisms ready to be deployed to the planet's surface. The psychic pressure of the hive mind affected everyone on Prandium, even non-psychers experiencing headaches, nightmares, and a pervasive sense of dread that intensified as the fleet drew closer. Sanctioned psychers who attempted to send astropathic messages for help found their thoughts drowned out by the hive mind's overwhelming presence, their minds crushed by contact with the alien intelligence. The Tyranid landing organisms, called mycetic spores, rained from orbit like a biological meteor shower. Each spore was a living drop pod containing dozens of Tyranid creatures, the spores themselves equipped with limited guidance systems that directed them toward concentrations of biomass. The spores impacted with enough force to crater the ground, then split open to release their cargoes. The first wave consisted primarily of hormigants and termagants, smaller Tyranid organisms that stood roughly human height but moved with insectoid speed. These creatures attacked in swarms numbering in the thousands, their only purpose to overwhelm defenders and begin the process of consuming all biomass on the planet. The civilian population of Prandium had nowhere to run because Tyranid invasions differ fundamentally from other threats. The Tyranids did not want territory or resources in any conventional sense. They wanted to consume every living thing on the planet, breaking down all biological matter and absorbing it into the hive fleet's biomass. The mycetic spores landed everywhere simultaneously, making no distinction between military targets and civilian centers. A farming settlement might find itself under attack by the same forces hitting military installations, because to the Tyranids, all biomass was equally valuable. The settlers who attempted to defend themselves discovered that Tyranid organisms felt no fear and could not be intimidated. Shooting a hormigant might kill it, but 20 more would continue the charge without hesitation. The Tyranid consumption process began immediately after the initial attacks, with specialized organisms called rippers swarming over fallen bodies and any other biological matter they encountered. The rippers were small creatures, each perhaps the size of a human hand, but they attacked in swarms of thousands. They possessed powerful jaws that could tear through flesh and bone, and they worked with terrifying efficiency. A ripper swarm could reduce a human body to nothing in minutes, the biomass being consumed and processed. The rippers did not distinguish between living and dead, attacking wounded humans who were still conscious and aware as the creatures literally ate them alive. The larger Tyranid organisms that followed the initial waves presented threats that PDF forces had no capacity to counter. Carnifexes were living tanks, creatures standing 4 meters tall and weighing several tons, their bodies armored with chitinous plates that shrugged off lasgun fire. These creatures carried bioweapons bonded to their bodies, venom cannons that fired crystallized toxins capable of melting through armor, or barbed stranglers that shot seeds which grew into strangling vines upon contact with flesh. A single Carnifex could destroy an entire PDF company, the soldiers' weapons unable to inflict meaningful damage while the creature tore through their formations. The PDF troopers who faced these organisms often broke and ran, their training and discipline insufficient to keep them fighting against such overwhelming threats. The synapse creatures that coordinated Tyranid forces exerted control through the hive mind's psychic network, directing lesser organisms with perfect precision. Warriors were the most common synapse creatures, standing 3 meters tall and equipped with multiple bioweapons. The warriors directed swarms of smaller organisms, sending them to attack specific targets or defend key positions. The psychic emanations from warriors affected humans who came too close, causing headaches, nausea, and in extreme cases, complete mental breakdown. Psykers who attempted to use their abilities against tyrannid forces found themselves overwhelmed by the hive mind's presence, their powers turning against them as the alien intelligence invaded their thoughts. The chaos incursion that struck hive world Cadia followed a different pattern, beginning not with external invasion, but with corruption from within. The cultists who had infiltrated Cadia's population over decades activated simultaneously, emerging from hiding to conduct rituals that weakened the barrier between reality and the warp. The rituals involved mass human sacrifice, with cultists slaughtering thousands in ceremonies designed to create psychic resonances that would tear holes in reality. The cultists had prepared carefully, identifying targets that would maximize the psychic impact of their sacrifices. They attacked Schola Progenium facilities, killing children whose potential service to the Imperium represented significant future value. They struck at ecclesiarchy cathedrals during major services, murdering thousands of worshippers whose faith created strong psychic signatures. The warp rifts that opened across Cadia's surface vomited demons into reality, creatures of pure chaos given temporary physical form. The demons ranged from minor entities like bloodletters and plaguebearers to greater demons that stood tens of meters tall and radiated corruption that mutated everything nearby. A bloodletter was a creature of pure rage, standing 2 meters tall with crimson skin and wielding a hellblade that burned with warp fire. These demons attacked with mindless fury, killing everything they encountered without strategy or purpose beyond spreading carnage. The plaguebearers were walking diseases, their bodies covered in sores and lesions that wept toxins. Their very presence spread infection, causing plague outbreaks that killed thousands even in areas where the demons themselves never reached. The civilian response to demonic incursion was complicated by the fact that most Imperial citizens had no framework for understanding what they were seeing. The Imperium suppresses knowledge of chaos, teaching that demons are superstitions or xenos threats rather than warp entities. A civilian confronted by a bloodletter might try to fight it with conventional weapons, only to discover that physical damage meant little to a creature that was not truly physical. The demons could be banished by destroying their material forms, but this required significant firepower that civilians did not possess. A lasgun could damage a bloodletter, but killing one required sustained fire that drained power packs quickly. Most civilians who encountered demons simply died, torn apart by creatures they could not comprehend. The mutations that accompanied chaos incursions affected everyone exposed to warp energies, with changes occurring rapidly and unpredictably. A civilian might develop extra limbs, their skin might change color or texture, or they might experience mental changes that altered their personality completely. The mutations were not always obviously malevolent, but the Imperium treated all mutation as corruption, requiring immediate execution. The Adeptus Arbites and inquisitorial forces that responded to chaos incursions killed mutants on sight, making no distinction between those who had embraced chaos willingly and those who were innocent victims of warp exposure. A child who developed a third eye or unusual skin pigmentation faced execution alongside cultists who had deliberately sold their souls to dark gods. The inquisitorial response to chaos incursions prioritized containment over civilian survival, with inquisitors authorized to employ any means necessary to prevent chaos from spreading. The Inquisition deployed specialized forces including Grey Knights, Space Marines specifically trained and equipped to fight demons, and inquisitorial stormtroopers equipped with sanctified weapons. These forces established containment zones around areas of demonic activity, killing anyone attempting to leave the zones regardless of their level of corruption. The logic was simple. Anyone exposed to chaos was potentially tainted, and allowing them to escape risked spreading corruption to uncontaminated areas. The containment zones became death traps where civilians found themselves caught between demons on one side and Imperial forces on the other, both willing to kill them. The evacuation protocols that theoretically governed civilian protection during invasions existed primarily on paper, elaborate plans that assumed resources and organization that never materialized when actually needed. The protocols called for orderly evacuation of civilians to designated safe zones, protection of evacuation routes by military forces, and prioritization of children and other vulnerable populations. In practice, evacuation during wartime meant chaos, with civilians fleeing in whatever direction seemed safest, while military forces focused on their own objectives. The safe zones designated in evacuation plans were often overrun before civilians could reach them, or they lacked the supplies and facilities needed to support large refugee populations. The refugee columns that formed during invasions became targets themselves, massive concentrations of humanity moving slowly along roads that were easily identified and attacked. An orc warband might attack a refugee column for sport, killing thousands while facing minimal resistance. Tyrannid organisms tracked refugee movements and directed forces to intercept them, viewing the columns as convenient concentrations of biomass. The imperial forces that encountered refugee columns often saw them as obstacles, impediments to military operations that needed to be cleared. Guard units might order refugees off roads to allow passage of military vehicles, forcing them into terrain where survival was unlikely. In some cases, guard forces simply drove through refugee columns, their vehicles crushing anyone too slow to move aside. The post-war conditions on worlds that survived invasions were often worse than the invasions themselves, the infrastructure destroyed, and the population traumatized and depleted. A world that successfully repelled an orc might find itself with half its population dead, its agricultural systems destroyed, and its industrial capacity reduced to rubble. The Imperium's response to these situations focused on restoring tithe compliance rather than humanitarian relief. The Administratum assessed the damage, calculated new tithe requirements based on remaining capacity, and expected the world to meet these requirements regardless of the population's suffering. A world that could no longer meet its food tithe might have its classification changed to a mining world, with the surviving population forced into new labor roles without consideration for their previous occupations or skills. The exterminatus declarations that ended some invasions represented the Imperium's ultimate admission of failure, the decision that a world could not be saved and must be destroyed to prevent whatever threatened it from spreading. The decision to declare exterminatus rested with inquisitors or high-ranking Imperial Navy officers, and it was not made lightly given the resources invested in Imperial worlds. However, when a world fell to chaos, corruption, or tyrannid infestation reached critical levels, exterminatus became the only option. The methods varied, from cyclonic torpedoes that triggered massive volcanic eruptions to virus bombs that killed all life on a planet's surface, to simple sustained orbital bombardment that reduced the surface to molten slag. The civilian populations on worlds facing exterminatus received no warning or evacuation opportunity. The Imperium could not risk allowing potentially corrupted individuals to escape, and the logistics of evacuating billions were impossible given the timeframes involved. The people simply died, vaporized by orbital bombardment or consumed by viral weapons, their deaths considered necessary sacrifices to protect the wider Imperium. The worlds themselves became dead rocks, their atmospheres burned away or poisoned beyond recovery, monuments to the Imperium's willingness to destroy what it could not save. Some exterminatus sites were eventually recolonized after centuries or millennia, new populations settling on worlds where billions had died, often with no knowledge of what had occurred there. The inquisitorial purges that followed successful defenses against chaos incursions killed as many civilians as the invasions themselves, the Inquisition operating on the principle that anyone exposed to chaos was potentially tainted and therefore must be eliminated. The purges began with identification of everyone who had been in areas of demonic activity, a process that often involved entire hive levels or city districts. The death rate in Imperial manufactorums averages between 8 and 12% annually, with variations depending on the specific industry and local safety standards, which is to say the complete absence of safety standards. A worker in a Necromunda Prometheum refinery has a life expectancy of approximately 15 years from their first day of employment, assuming they survived childhood to reach working age. The causes of death are cataloged in administratum records with bureaucratic precision that borders on the obsessive, each fatality documented and filed, even though no one will ever review the information for purposes of improving conditions. Industrial accidents account for roughly 40% of worker deaths, encompassing everything from being crushed by machinery to chemical burns to falls from elevated work platforms. The machinery in Imperial manufactorums operates without safety guards or emergency shutoffs accessible to workers, and the production pace leaves no time for caution. A worker operating a stamping press might lose focus for a single second after 16 hours of repetitive motion, and that second costs them their hand or arm. The overseer notes the injury, has the worker dragged aside, and assigns someone else to the station within minutes. If the injured worker survives, they receive basic cauterization to prevent them from bleeding out, then are sent to a Medicae station, where an underpaid chirurgeon assesses whether they can be patched up sufficiently to return to work. A hand lost at the wrist might warrant a crude prosthetic hook if the worker's production record justifies the expense. An arm lost at the shoulder usually means the worker is finished, their body no longer useful for their assigned labor. These workers are processed for corpse starch within days, the administratum seeing no point in maintaining individuals who cannot contribute to production quotas. Malnutrition and disease account for another 30% of worker deaths. The combination of inadequate rations and unsanitary living conditions, creating a population that is perpetually on the edge of starvation and constantly fighting infections. A worker who contracts a respiratory infection from the toxic air in the manufactorum might continue working through the illness because taking time off means losing rations. The infection worsens, spreading to their lungs and causing pneumonia, but they keep working because the alternative is starvation. Eventually, they collapse at their station, coughing blood, and die there while the production line continues around them. The body is removed during the next shift change, documented in the mortality logs, and sent to corpse starch processing. The worker's family receives no notification beyond the absence of their relative and the cessation of their ration allocation. Violence accounts for approximately 20% of deaths, encompassing gang warfare in the underhive, fights between workers over resources or personal disputes, and executions by authorities for various infractions. A worker might be killed in a gang crossfire while walking home from their shift, their death recorded as gang-related violence in Arbides reports, but ultimately just another entry in the mortality statistics. Others die in fights over water rations during distribution, the desperation of thirst driving people to kill for a few extra liters. The Adeptus Arbites execute workers regularly for crimes ranging from theft to sedition to simply being in the wrong place when authorities needed to make an example. These executions are documented with the same bureaucratic thoroughness as industrial accidents, the cause of death noted as legal sanction, and the body processed accordingly. The remaining 10% of deaths come from causes that defy easy categorization, everything from suicide to exposure to environmental hazards to simply giving up and dying from accumulated trauma and exhaustion. Workers throw themselves from the upper levels of hive cities with enough regularity that the Adeptus Arbites no longer investigate unless the body lands somewhere that disrupts traffic or production. The environmental hazards of hive worlds kill in ways both obvious and subtle, from toxic gas leaks that suffocate entire hab blocks to radiation exposure from poorly shielded reactors that causes cancers years later. Some workers simply stop eating and drinking, their minds broken by the relentless grind of imperial existence, and die quietly in their hab units while their families watch helplessly. Death from natural old age is so rare in the lower levels of imperial society that it barely registers in mortality statistics. A worker who survives to age 50 has beaten odds that would make any gambling man wealthy, and those who reach 60 are statistical anomalies. The combination of toxic environments, inadequate nutrition, constant physical labor, and complete lack of medical care ensures that bodies break down decades before they would under better conditions. A 40-year-old worker on Armageddon might have the physical condition of a 70-year-old on a more fortunate world, their joints destroyed by repetitive motion, their lungs scarred by chemical exposure, their organs failing from accumulated toxins. These workers continue laboring until they physically cannot, then die either at their stations or shortly after being sent home when they become too weak to meet production quotas. The corpse disposal systems that handle the constant flow of dead bodies in imperial cities are marvels of industrial efficiency, processing thousands of tons of human remains daily. The Corpse Guild on Necromunda operates hundreds of collection points throughout the hive cities, locations where bodies can be delivered for processing. The guild pays small bounties for bodies in reasonable condition, creating an entire economy around corpse collection. Families who cannot afford proper burial for their dead sell the bodies to collectors who transport them to processing facilities. The collectors operate vehicles that are essentially mobile morgues, refrigerated compartments filled with bodies stacked like cargo. The collectors make regular routes through hab blocks and manufactorum districts, their arrival announced by distinctive bells or horns that signal residents to bring out their dead. The processing facilities themselves are vast industrial complexes that operate continuously, their rendering vats never cooling. The bodies arrive on conveyor systems that sort them by condition and size, with relatively intact corpses separated from those that are badly damaged or decomposed. The intact bodies are stripped of any remaining clothing or personal effects, these items collected and sold as scrap or recycled materials. The bodies then move to stations where workers remove augmetic components, cutting away bionic limbs or extracting cranial implants. These augmetics are valuable and get refurbished for reuse, sold to Medicae facilities or tech priests who install them in new recipients. The workers performing this extraction are typically low-level tech thralls or menials who have been doing the job long enough to become desensitized to handling corpses. After augmetic removal, the bodies enter the rendering vats, massive containers filled with chemical solutions that break down organic tissue. The vats operate at high temperatures, the chemical reactions generating heat that must be vented to prevent the facilities from becoming unbearably hot. The rendering process takes several hours, during which the bodies dissolve into a thick slurry of proteins, fats, and other organic compounds. The slurry is then processed further, with different components separated for various uses. The protein fraction becomes the base material for corpse starch, mixed with synthetic nutrients and preservatives, before being formed into the blocks that constitute basic rations. The fat content is extracted and refined into various industrial lubricants, or can be converted into low-grade promethium fuel through additional processing. The bones that do not fully dissolve in the rendering vats are collected and ground into meal that serves as fertilizer for agri-complexes or as filler material in construction compounds. Nothing is wasted because waste represents lost efficiency, and the administratum's production quotas account for every kilogram of input material. The processing facilities maintain detailed records of throughput, documenting how many bodies were processed each day and how much corpse starch was produced. These records are filed with the administratum and factor into the facility's performance evaluations. A facility that falls below expected production levels faces investigation and potential replacement of management, regardless of whether the shortfall resulted from lower death rates or processing inefficiencies. The workers in corpse starch facilities develop a particular psychological profile, a detachment from the reality of their labor that allows them to function while handling thousands of human remains daily. New workers often experience severe psychological distress in their first weeks, the constant exposure to death, and the knowledge that they are processing human bodies into food proving overwhelming. Some quit or request transfers, though such requests are rarely granted. Most adapt through a combination of psychological dissociation and dark humor, treating the bodies as raw materials rather than as people who once lived. The facilities provide no counseling or mental health support, the administratum viewing such services as unnecessary expenses. The alternative to corpse starch processing for some bodies is promethium fuel conversion, a process that is less common but serves specific needs in the Imperium's endless hunger for energy. The conversion facilities operate similarly to corpse starch plants, but use different chemical processes that break down organic matter into hydrocarbon chains suitable for use as fuel. The process is less efficient than standard promethium refining from petroleum sources, but it provides a use for bodies that are too damaged or diseased for food processing. A body that died from toxic exposure or radiation poisoning cannot be safely rendered into corpse starch, as the toxins or radioactive isotopes would contaminate the food supply. These bodies are instead converted into fuel, the chemical processes breaking down the contaminants or concentrating them in waste products that can be disposed of separately. The fuel produced from human remains is typically low-grade, suitable for industrial heating or power generation, but not for vehicles or weapons that require higher-quality promethium. The facilities that produce this fuel are located in the most undesirable areas of hive cities, usually deep in the underhive, where the smell and environmental impact affect only those who already live in terrible conditions. The workers in these facilities face even worse health hazards than those in corpse starch plants, the chemical processes releasing toxic fumes and the bodies being processed often containing dangerous levels of contaminants. The life expectancy of a fuel conversion facility worker is measured in months rather than years, the toxic exposure causing rapid deterioration of health. Burial in consecrated ground represents a privilege reserved for those who demonstrated exceptional service to the Imperium or who possessed sufficient wealth and influence to purchase such arrangements. The ecclesiarchy maintains cemeteries on many imperial worlds, plots of land that have been blessed by priests and designated as holy ground. Burial in these locations costs amounts that exceed what most workers earn in their entire lives, making it accessible only to guild masters, successful merchants, mid-level administratum officials, and others who accumulated significant resources. The cemeteries are maintained by the ecclesiarchy, with groundskeepers ensuring the graves remain in good condition and priests conducting regular services to honor the dead. The graves themselves vary in elaborateness based on what the deceased's family could afford. A basic burial plot might consist of a simple marker with the deceased's name and dates of service, the body interred in a plain coffin or shroud. More expensive arrangements include elaborate headstones carved with religious iconography, crypts that can hold multiple family members, or even small chapels built over the graves of particularly wealthy or important individuals. The ecclesiarchy encourages families to purchase the most elaborate arrangements they can afford, teaching that proper burial demonstrates respect for the deceased and increases their chances of sitting at the emperor's side in the afterlife. The concept of the emperor's service continuing after death manifests in several ways throughout imperial society, the most common being servitor conversion. The process of converting deceased bodies into servitors differs from the lobotomization and augmentation of living criminals, as the deceased require different procedures to make their remains functional. A fresh corpse, one that died recently and has not yet begun decomposing, can be converted into a servitor through a combination of preservation techniques and augmentation. The body is first treated with chemicals that prevent decomposition and maintain tissue integrity, essentially mummifying the remains while keeping them flexible enough for movement. The brain is removed and replaced with a basic cognitive unit, a mechanical device that can process simple instructions and control the body's movements. The augmentation of corpse servitors follows similar patterns to living servitor conversion, with mechanical components grafted onto the body to enhance its capabilities or provide specialized functions. A corpse servitor intended for labor might receive enhanced mechanical limbs and reinforced skeletal structure. One designed for technical work gets specialized tools and sensory equipment. The advantage of using corpses rather than living subjects is that there are no ethical concerns about the subject's suffering and no risk of the servitor retaining memories or personality traits that might interfere with its function. The disadvantage is that corpse servitors are more fragile than those made from living subjects, the preserved tissue being more prone to damage and requiring more frequent maintenance. Servo skull creation represents another form of post-mortem employment, particularly for individuals who held positions of importance or demonstrated exceptional loyalty to the Imperium. A servo skull is created by removing the cranium from a corpse, cleaning it thoroughly, and installing mechanical components that allow it to float and perform various functions. The skulls are equipped with anti-gravity suspensors, basic cogitators for processing commands, and various tools or sensors depending on their intended purpose. Some servo skulls serve as mobile recording devices, equipped with picked recorders and audio pickups. Others function as personal assistants to inquisitors or high-ranking officials, carrying messages or performing simple tasks. Some are armed with weapons like laws cutters or needle pistols, serving as defensive units. The creation of servo skulls is considered an honor, as it allows the deceased to continue serving the Imperium in death. Families sometimes petition the Adeptus Mechanicus to convert their deceased relatives into servo skulls, though such requests are rarely granted unless the deceased held positions that justified the expense and effort. The tech priests who create servo skulls perform the work with ritualistic precision, treating each skull as a sacred object that deserves proper respect. The skulls are often decorated with engravings, blessed with holy oils, and inscribed with prayers before being activated. A servo skull might serve for decades or even centuries, its mechanical components maintained and replaced as needed while the bone structure remains intact. Memorial practices for ordinary citizens are minimal to non-existent, the Imperium viewing the common dead as having fulfilled their purpose simply by living and working until they could no longer do so. Mass graves serve as the primary memorial for workers who die without the means for individual burial or whose bodies are not claimed by families. These graves are typically large pits dug in waste zones or under hive areas, locations where the land has no other use. The bodies are dumped into the pits without ceremony, stacked until the pit is full, then covered with earth or rubble. A simple marker might indicate the pit's location and the approximate number of bodies it contains, but individual identification is not maintained. The pits become anonymous repositories for thousands of dead, their occupants forgotten as soon as the earth covers them. The memorial walls maintained in some ecclesiarchy cathedrals represent a slightly more dignified form of remembrance, though still impersonal and focused on collective rather than individual memory. These walls are covered with plaques or inscriptions listing the names of faithful citizens who died in service to the emperor, the lists organized by date or by the manner of death. A wall might contain the names of workers who died in a specific manufactorum accident, soldiers who fell in a particular battle, or civilians who perished during an invasion. The walls serve as places where families can come to find their relatives' names among thousands of others, providing some small comfort that the deceased was acknowledged even if they received no individual memorial. The process of getting a name added to a memorial wall requires paperwork and often payment to the ecclesiarchy, making it inaccessible to the poorest families. A family must file a petition with the local cathedral, providing documentation of the deceased's identity and service record. The ecclesiarchy reviews the petition to verify that the deceased was a faithful servant of the emperor and did not die under circumstances that would make their commemoration inappropriate. A worker executed for heresy would not be memorialized, nor would someone who died while committing a crime. Those approved for commemoration have their names added to the walls during annual ceremonies, priests reading out the names of the newly dead while congregations pray for their souls. Most imperial citizens are simply forgotten, their lives mattering only as statistics in administratum ledgers that track population numbers, production output, and mortality rates. A worker who dies at their station becomes a data point in multiple databases, their death recorded in manufactorum production logs, administratum census records, and corpse guild processing documentation. The various agencies that track this information do not communicate with each other effectively, resulting in records that often conflict or contain errors. A deceased worker might remain listed as active in administratum employment records for years after their death, their ration allocations continuing to be distributed until someone notices the discrepancy. Conversely, living workers sometimes find themselves listed as deceased due to clerical errors, facing bureaucratic nightmares as they attempt to prove they are still alive. The families left behind when workers die face immediate practical concerns that override any grief they might feel. The loss of a worker means the loss of their ration allocation and income, creating resource shortages that threaten the family's survival. The Administratum provides no death benefits or support for families of deceased workers, viewing such assistance as unnecessary given that the family members can simply work themselves. Children who lose parents are expected to take up work assignments as soon as they are old enough, replacing the lost labor capacity. Spouses who lose partners are expected to continue working and managing their households without support. The elderly or disabled who lose their primary caregivers often die shortly afterward, unable to obtain resources or care on their own. The psychological impact of constant death on imperial citizens creates populations that are simultaneously traumatized and desensitized. Workers become accustomed to seeing their colleagues die, the deaths becoming routine events that barely register emotionally. A worker might see someone crushed by machinery in the morning, feel a moment of horror or sympathy, then return to their tasks because stopping work is not an option. The constant exposure to death and suffering breaks down normal human empathy responses, leaving people capable of witnessing terrible things without strong emotional reactions. This desensitization serves a protective function, allowing people to continue functioning in environments that would otherwise drive them to psychological breakdown. The religious framework provided by the ecclesiarchy offers some comfort to the dying and bereaved, teaching that faithful servants of the emperor will be rewarded in the afterlife. The promise of sitting at the emperor's side after death gives meaning to lives that would otherwise seem pointless, the suffering and hardship reframed as tests of faith that will be rewarded eternally. Workers facing death often recite prayers, asking the emperor to accept their service and grant them peace. Families of the deceased take comfort in believing their relatives are no longer suffering, that death released them from the burdens of imperial existence. The ecclesiarchy reinforces these beliefs through funeral services and memorial ceremonies, priests assuring congregations that the faithful dead have earned their rest. The reality that most imperial citizens face is that their deaths will be quick, unremarked, and followed by their bodies being processed into resources for the living. They will not be buried in consecrated ground or memorialized on cathedral walls. Their names will not be remembered beyond a generation or two, if that long. They will simply cease to exist, their bodies rendered into corpse starch that feeds other workers who will eventually die and be processed in turn. This cycle continues endlessly, each generation living and dying in service to an imperium that views them as expendable resources rather than as individuals with inherent worth. The grim mathematics of imperial existence mean that a single human life has negligible value in calculations that deal with populations in the billions. The death of one worker affects nothing beyond their immediate family, and even that impact is temporary as others step in to fill the void. The Administratum's ledgers track deaths in aggregate numbers, thousands or millions dying reduced to percentages and statistics that inform resource allocation decisions. A manufactorum that loses 10,000 workers in a year is not seen as a tragedy, but as a data point indicating the need to increase recruitment or adjust production quotas to account for reduced labor capacity. The individual stories, the suffering and loss experienced by real people, disappear into the vast machinery of imperial bureaucracy. In the end, the miserable life of regular citizens in the Imperium concludes as it was lived, in service to a system that grinds human beings into resources with mechanical efficiency. The final service these citizens provide is their bodies, processed and repurposed to sustain the endless cycle of imperial existence. Their deaths feed the living, their remains converted into the rations that keep other workers functional, their augmetics salvaged and installed in new bodies, their skulls potentially serving as servo skulls if they were fortunate enough to be deemed worthy. The Imperium wastes nothing, extracting value from its citizens in life and death, maintaining itself through the consumption of countless human lives across 1,000,000 worlds. This is the reality of the 41st millennium, where there is only war, and where even death offers no escape from service to the God Emperor of mankind.